A millionaire hires a desperate single mother in need of money to bathe his paraplegic son, who was even rejected by his own wife. What happens next was not part of the plan and will warm your heart. In the sprawling hills of Beverly Hills, where mansions dotted the landscape like jewels on velvet, Thornfield Estate stood apart from the rest. Not because of its grandeur, though it possessed that in abundance, but because of the heavy silence that seemed to permeate its grounds. The once vibrant gardens, while meticulously maintained by a staff of gardeners, had lost their soul. The fountains still flowed, but their music seemed mournful rather than merry. Inside, Richard Thornfield sat in his study, his weathered hands clutching a stack of resumes. At 65, he carried himself with the bearing of a man who had built an empire, but his eyes betrayed a deep-seated worry that no amount of wealth could assuage. The evening sun cast long shadows across the mahogany desk, where he had spent countless hours building his technology empire. But these days, his attention was focused on a much more personal matter. Through the open window, he could hear the distant sound of physical therapists leaving his son's wing of the mansion. Another day, another series of exercises, another round of frustration. Alexander, his only son, had once been the embodiment of vitality, a championship swimmer, a brilliant mind, and the heir apparent to Thornfield Technologies. Now, at 28, he spent his days confined to a wheelchair, his dreams seemingly as paralyzed as his legs. Richard's fingers trembled slightly as he picked up another resume from the stack. Julia Martinez, he read aloud, his voice barely a whisper in the vast study. Something about this one felt different. Unlike the other candidates who boasted prestigious nursing degrees and experience in expensive private care facilities, Julia's application spoke of real-life experience. A single mother who had spent years caring for patients in rehabilitation centers. Her reference letters spoke not just of her technical competence, but of her extraordinary compassion. The sound of breaking glass from Alexander's wing interrupted his thoughts. Richard closed his eyes, knowing what would follow. The angry shouts of his son echoed through the corridor, followed by the hurried footsteps of the day nurse, the third one this month, gathering her belongings and leaving. "I don't need another fucking babysitter," Alexander's voice carried through the mansion. "Tell him to stop trying to fix me." Richard's gaze drifted to the family photo on his desk, taken just 2 years ago. Alexander stood tall and proud, his arm around his new wife, Victoria. Victoria, who now spent more time at social events than with her husband, who couldn't bear to look at Alexander in his current state, who treated her marriage vows as if they came with a money-back guarantee. The intercom buzzed and his secretary's voice filtered through. "Mr. Thornfield, Mrs. Victoria is requesting access to the additional credit card again." "Deny it," he replied firmly, his jaw tightening. He had watched over the past year as Victoria's shopping sprees had grown more extravagant, her visits to his son more infrequent. Just yesterday, he had overheard her on the phone with her friends, discussing her plans for after, a word that made his blood run cold. Looking back at Julia's resume, Richard made his decision. He picked up his phone and dialed the number listed. After 3 rings, a warm, confident voice answered. "Hello? Ms. Martinez, this is Richard Thornfield. I'm calling about your application for the live-in caregiver position." There was a brief pause before she responded, "Yes, Mr. Thornfield. I'm very interested in the position. I'd like you to start as soon as possible," he said, his voice carrying a hint of desperation he couldn't quite mask. "The position includes accommodation for you and your daughter. I understand she's 8? "Yes, Sophie is 8, Julia confirmed, surprise evident in her voice at his knowledge of this detail. "Mr. Thornfield, I should be upfront. Some of your requirements in the job posting. I've read your references, Ms. Martinez. They speak of your ability to connect with patients others had given up on. That's exactly what I need, what my son needs." He paused, weighing his next words carefully. "The salary will be triple what was listed in the posting." Another pause, longer this time. Richard could almost hear her thinking, weighing the opportunity against the challenges she knew she would face. "When would you like me to start?" she finally asked. "Tomorrow, if possible. I'll have everything prepared for you and your daughter." After finishing the call and making arrangements, Richard stood and walked to the window. The sun had set, leaving the gardens in shadow. In the reflecting pool below, he caught a glimpse of his own reflection. A man desperate to save his son, willing to bet everything on a stranger with kind eyes and stellar references. In Alexander's wing, another crash echoed through the halls. Richard closed his eyes, praying he had made the right decision. Tomorrow would bring Julia Martinez and her daughter into their lives, and with them, perhaps, a chance at healing what seemed beyond repair. Little did he know that this decision would set in motion events that would transform not just Alexander's life, but the lives of everyone within the walls of Thornfield Estate, in ways none of them could have imagined. Julia Martinez stood at the imposing gates of Thornfield Estate, holding her daughter Sophie's small hand in hers. The morning sun cast long shadows through the wrought iron gates, creating patterns on the cobblestone driveway that stretched ahead of them. Her other hand clutched a worn leather bag containing everything they owned, their entire life packed into one piece of luggage. "Mommy, it looks like a castle," Sophie exclaimed, her brown eyes wide with wonder. Her backpack, covered in butterfly stickers, seemed to dwarf her small frame. Julia managed to smile, trying to hide her own nervousness. "Remember what we talked about, Mija. This is going to be our new home, but we have to be very respectful. The young man I'm going to help is having a difficult time." Before Sophie could respond, the gates slowly opened with a soft mechanical hum. A security guard approached them with a professional smile. "Ms. Martinez, Mr. Thornfield is expecting you. Please follow me." As they walked up the driveway, Julia couldn't help but feel overwhelmed by the grandeur surrounding them. The mansion loomed ahead, its architecture a stunning blend of modern and classical elements. The gardens, though beautiful, seemed somehow sterile, lacking the lived-in feeling of a true home. The guard led them through massive double doors into a foyer that could have housed their entire previous apartment. Richard Thornfield stood waiting for them, his tall frame straight despite his years, his silver hair perfectly coiffed. His smile was genuine but tired. "Ms. Martinez, welcome to Thornfield Estate," he said, extending his hand. Then, kneeling down to Sophie's level, he added, "And you must be Sophie. I heard you like butterflies." Sophie nodded shyly, clutching her mother's hand tighter. "Well then," Richard continued, standing up, "you might be interested to know that we have a butterfly garden on the east side of the property. Perhaps you'll help keep an eye on them for me." Sophie's face lit up, but before she could respond, a crash echoed from somewhere above them, followed by angry shouting. "I told you to get out! I don't want another one of his hired nurses." Julia felt Sophie press against her leg. Richard's face tightened, but he maintained his composure. "That would be my son, Alexander," he said quietly. "Perhaps we should get you and Sophie settled in your quarters first. Then we can discuss the specifics of the position." They followed Richard through a series of corridors, each more elegant than the last, until they reached a beautiful suite with 2 bedrooms, a sitting area, and a small kitchenette. The windows overlooked the promised butterfly garden, and Sophie's gasp of delight brought a genuine smile to Richard's face. "I took the liberty of having the smaller bedroom prepared for Sophie," Richard explained, opening a door to reveal a room painted in soft yellows and greens, with butterfly decals on the walls. "I hope this is acceptable." Julia felt tears pricking at her eyes. After years of struggling to provide for Sophie in their tiny apartment, this seemed like a dream. "It's more than acceptable, Mr. Thornfield. It's perfect. Please call me Richard." He hesitated, then continued. "I should warn you about Alexander. The accident, it changed him. He was always strong-willed, but now—" Richard's voice trailed off, his eyes distant. "His wife, Victoria, she finds it difficult to handle his condition. She's rarely here." Julia nodded, understanding the unspoken message. She had read between the lines of the job posting and her phone conversation with Richard. This wasn't just about physical care. It was about trying to save someone who might not want to be saved. "Mr. Thornfield." "Richard," Julia said, her voice firm but gentle. "I've worked with many patients who had given up. Sometimes the hardest injuries to heal are the ones we can't see." Richard's eyes met hers, and she saw a glimmer of hope there. "Then you understand why I chose you. Your references, they spoke of your ability to reach people who had lost hope. Alexander, Another crash interrupted him. followed by the sound of wheels on hardwood floors and angry muttering. "I should go check on him," Richard said, his shoulders sagging slightly. "Take some time to get settled. We'll have dinner at 7 in the main dining room. Alexander usually takes his meals in his room, but, well, perhaps that will change." After Richard left, Julia sat on the plush sofa trying to process everything. Sophie was already exploring her new room, exclaiming over every discovery. "Mommy, there's a butterfly lamp, and look at these books." Julia smiled, but her mind was upstairs with her new patient. She had dealt with difficult cases before, but something told her Alexander Thornfield would be different. The anger in his voice, the pain that seemed to echo through these grand halls. This wasn't just about physical rehabilitation. As if reading her thoughts, another shout echoed from above, followed by the sound of a door slamming. Julia took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. She had learned long ago that the patients who pushed everyone away were often the ones who needed help the most. Standing up, she walked to the window and looked out at the butterfly garden. Somewhere in this mansion was a young man who had lost everything he thought defined him. Her job wasn't just to help him with physical therapy or daily tasks. It was to help him find himself again. A soft knock at their door interrupted her thoughts. Opening it, she found a maid holding a stack of towels. "Mrs. Victoria asked me to bring these," the maid said quietly, her eyes downcast. "She also wanted me to inform you that she'll be away for the next week. Shopping in Paris," she said. Julia accepted the towels, noting the resignation in the maid's voice. It seemed there were many layers to the drama unfolding in Thornfield Estate, and she had just stepped right into the middle of it all. The morning sun had barely risen when Julia made her way through the quiet halls of Thornfield Estate. She had spent much of the night studying Alexander's medical files, provided by Richard. The physical challenges were significant, but not insurmountable. It was the emotional walls she would need to break down first. As she approached Alexander's wing of the mansion, she could hear movement inside. Taking a deep breath, she knocked on the door. "Go away." The voice from within was sharp, angry. "Mr. Thornfield, I'm Julia Martinez, your new caregiver. I'm coming in now." She kept her voice firm but gentle, turning the handle before he could protest further. The room was spacious and luxurious, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the gardens. But Julia's attention was immediately drawn to the young man in the wheelchair by the window. Alexander Thornfield was strikingly handsome, with his father's strong features and dark hair, but his face was twisted in a scowl. The morning light emphasized the tension in his shoulders, the rigid way he held himself. "I don't need a caregiver," he said, his voice cold. "I especially don't need another one of my father's attempts to fix me." His hands gripped the wheels of his chair tightly, knuckles white with tension. Julia moved further into the room, noting the overturned water glass on the bedside table, the untouched breakfast tray. "I'm not here to fix you, Mr. Thornfield. I'm here to help you regain your independence." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Independence? Look at me. I can't even take a shower without help. My wife can't stand to touch me." "What independence are you talking about?" "The kind that starts with small steps," Julia replied, moving to right the water glass. "Like having breakfast without throwing it across the room." Alexander's eyes narrowed. "You don't know anything about me." "I know you were a champion swimmer," she said, beginning to clean up the spilled water. "I know you graduated top of your class from Stanford. I know you were being groomed to take over your father's company." She paused, meeting his gaze directly. "And I know that none of those things define who you are now." "Get out," he growled, but Julia noticed a flicker of something in his eyes, uncertainty perhaps, or surprise at her directness. "I will after you've had your breakfast." She moved to the tray, checking the temperature of the coffee. "It's still warm. Would you like to eat by the window, or should I bring it to the bed?" Alexander stared at her, clearly thrown by her calm persistence. "You're not going to leave, are you?" "No, Mr. Thornfield, I'm not. And since we're going to be spending a lot of time together, you might as well call me Julia." A tense silence filled the room. Finally, Alexander wheeled himself closer to the small table by the window. "Fine. But don't expect me to make this easy for you." "I never expect things to be easy," Julia replied, placing the breakfast tray on the table. "But I do expect them to be possible." As she arranged his breakfast, a small voice called from the doorway, "Mommy." Both Julia and Alexander turned to see Sophie standing there, still in her pajamas with butterflies on them. She looked curiously at Alexander, then at the wheelchair. "Sophie, honey, you should be getting ready for breakfast," Julia said, moving toward her daughter. But Sophie, with the directness only children possess, walked straight up to Alexander's wheelchair. "Hi, I'm Sophie. Why are you in a chair with wheels? Is it fun?" Julia saw Alexander's face change, the hardness in his expression cracking slightly. For a moment he seemed unsure how to respond to such innocent curiosity. "Sophie," Julia began, but Alexander held up a hand. It's not exactly fun," he said, his voice softer than it had been moments before. "It helps me move around because my legs don't work like they used to." Sophie nodded thoughtfully. "Like when my bicycle had a flat tire. I couldn't ride it, but Mommy fixed it." A ghost of a smile touched Alexander's lips, so brief Julia almost missed it. "Something like that, but more complicated." "Sophie, why don't you go get dressed?" Julia suggested gently. "Remember, Richard said we could visit the butterfly garden later." Sophie's face lit up. "Can Mr. Alexander come see the butterflies too?" The question hung in the air, heavy with possibility. Julia watched Alexander's face, saw the conflict there. The instinct to reject any invitation warring with something else, something sparked by Sophie's innocent request. "Maybe another time," he finally said, his voice rough but not unkind. After Sophie left, Alexander turned back to the window, but Julia noticed his shoulders weren't quite as tense. "She's direct," he commented. "Yes, she is," Julia agreed, adjusting his breakfast tray. "Children usually are. They see things as they are without all the complications we adults add." Alexander picked up his fork, then paused. "This doesn't change anything. I still don't want you here." "Noted," Julia replied calmly. "Now shall we discuss your physical therapy schedule for today, or would you prefer to finish your breakfast first?" He shot her a glare, but there was less venom in it than before. As he began to eat, Julia moved around the room, straightening things, giving him space while maintaining her presence. Through the window she could see Sophie in the butterfly garden below, her small figure dancing among the flowers. When Alexander spoke again, his voice was quieter. "Why did you take this job?" Julia turned to face him, considering her answer carefully. "Because sometimes, Mr. Thornfield, the hardest part of healing isn't the physical challenge. It's remembering who you are beyond your limitations." He didn't respond, but she noticed he finished his breakfast, and when she outlined his therapy schedule for the day, he didn't immediately reject it. It was a small victory, but Julia had learned long ago that sometimes the smallest victories were the most important ones. Victoria Thornfield's heels clicked against the marble floors of Thornfield Estate like small explosions. She had returned early from her shopping trip, her arms laden with designer bags, her perfect features arranged in a mask of concern that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Richard," she called out, spotting her father-in-law in his study, "why wasn't I informed about this new arrangement?" Richard looked up from his desk, his expression carefully neutral. "Victoria, I wasn't expecting you back for another week." "Clearly," she said, dropping her bags onto an antique chair. "I had to hear from the staff that you've hired some woman to live here, with her child no less." "Julia Martinez is a highly qualified caregiver," Richard replied, his voice firm. Alexander needs his wife," Victoria interrupted, tossing her perfectly styled hair. "Not some stranger with a child running around the house." Richard's eyes hardened. His wife? The same wife who hasn't assisted him with a single therapy session? Who refuses to help with even the most basic care? Victoria's face flushed. "That's different. I'm his wife, not his nurse. It's degrading for both of us." "Degrading?" Richard's voice was quiet but sharp. "What's degrading is watching my son suffer while his wife shops in Paris." Before Victoria could respond, they heard the sound of wheels on hardwood floors, accompanied by Julia's voice and, surprisingly, a laugh. Small and rusty, but unmistakably Alexander's. Victoria moved to the door, her eyes narrowing as she watched Julia wheeling Alexander toward the elevator that would take them to the therapy room. Sophie skipped alongside them, chattering about the butterflies she'd seen that morning. "This is inappropriate," Victoria hissed. "That child, that woman, they're turning this house into a circus." "That woman," Richard replied, standing, has accomplished more in 3 days than any other caregiver has in months. Alexander is participating in his therapy sessions. He's eating regularly. He even agreed to join us for dinner tonight. Victoria's perfectly manicured fingers gripped the doorframe. Tonight? But I had plans. Cancel them, Richard said firmly. For once, be present for your husband. In the therapy room, unaware of the tension upstairs, Julia was helping Alexander with his exercises. She had modified the routine, incorporating elements that engaged both his body and his mind. "You're holding back," she observed, watching him work with the resistance bands. Alexander grunted with effort. "I'm doing exactly what you showed me." "No, you're doing what you think you can do," Julia corrected. "There's a difference." He dropped the bands, frustration evident on his face. "What's the point? I'll never swim again, never run again, never." "Never is a long time, Mr. Thornfield," Julia interrupted. "And you don't know what you're capable of until you truly try." "Why do you care?" he demanded, his voice rough with emotion. "This is just a job to you." Julia knelt beside his wheelchair, meeting his gaze directly. "Is that what you think? That I spent years training, working with patients, helping them rebuild their lives just for a paycheck?" Something in her tone made Alexander look at her, really look at her, for the first time. He saw the determination in her eyes, the compassion that ran deeper than professional obligation. "Then why?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Before Julia could answer, Sophie burst into the room, her face alight with excitement. "Mommy, Mr. Alexander, I found a chrysalis in the garden. Come see." Julia watched Alexander's face, saw the internal struggle there. Finally, he said, "I can't. The garden paths aren't wheelchair accessible." "Actually," Julia smiled, "Richard had ramps installed yesterday. All the main paths are now accessible." Alexander's eyes widened slightly. "He did?" "He did," Julia confirmed. "So, what do you say? Want to see this chrysalis?" For a moment, Alexander didn't respond. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Okay." But just for a few minutes. As Julia helped him navigate the new ramps toward the garden, neither of them noticed Victoria watching from an upstairs window, her perfectly manicured nails digging into her palms, her eyes cold with calculation. In the garden, Sophie led them to a sheltered corner where, sure enough, a chrysalis hung from a branch, its surface gleaming in the afternoon sun. "See?" Sophie pointed excitedly. "It's going to become a butterfly. Miss Garcia at school says it takes time, but it's worth waiting for." Alexander stared at the chrysalis, something shifting in his expression. "How long?" he asked. 2 weeks, Sophie replied confidently. "Will you help me watch it, to make sure it's safe?" Julia held her breath, watching the interaction. These moments, these small connections, were often where healing began. Alexander looked at the chrysalis, then at Sophie's hopeful face, then finally at Julia. Something in his eyes had changed, a spark of something that might have been hope, or might have been fear of hope. 2 weeks, he said quietly. "Okay. I'll help you watch it." Above them, unseen, Victoria turned away from the window, pulling out her phone and dialing a number with sharp, angry movements. "James, we need to talk. Things are complicated. Meet me at the usual place." The sun continued to shine on the garden, on the chrysalis, on the small group gathered beneath it, a tableau of possibility and change, while shadows gathered in the mansion above them. Victoria sat at her usual table in the secluded corner of Café Laurent, her fingers drumming impatiently against the fine tablecloth. The afternoon crowd was thin, just as she preferred for these meetings. When James appeared, sliding smoothly into the seat across from her, she barely waited for him to settle before speaking. "Things are becoming complicated," she said, her voice low and tense. "Richard hired a new caregiver, a woman, and she's different from the others." James raised an eyebrow, signaling the waiter for his usual scotch. "Different how?" "Alexander is responding to her," Victoria spat, her perfectly painted lips curling in distaste. "She has this little daughter, and somehow they're—" She waved her hand dismissively. "It's disrupting everything." "Darling." James reached across the table, catching her restless fingers in his. "We knew this wouldn't be simple. These things take time." "Time is something we don't have," Victoria hissed. "Richard's getting suspicious. And now with this woman there," She paused as the waiter delivered James's drink. She's making Alexander hopeful. He's participating in therapy, joining family dinners. Yesterday I found him in the garden, actually smiling. James took a careful sip of his scotch. And this is a problem because... Victoria leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper. The prenuptial agreement has a clause. If I leave him while he's showing significant improvement in his condition, I get nothing. Absolutely nothing. Back at Thornfield Estate, Julia was helping Alexander with his afternoon exercises when Sophie burst into the therapy room, clutching a book. "Mr. Alexander," she exclaimed, "look what I found in the library. It's about swimming in the Olympics. Did you really win medals like the people in this book?" Alexander tensed, and Julia prepared herself for the usual sharp response. But instead, he wheeled himself closer to Sophie, his movements careful but deliberate. "I didn't win Olympic medals," he said softly, "but I did win some national championships. Would you like to see them?" Sophie's eyes widened. "You still have them?" "They're in a box somewhere," he replied, a shadow crossing his face. "I asked the staff to pack them away after the accident." Julia watched the interaction carefully, noting the mix of pain and nostalgia in Alexander's expression. "Perhaps," she suggested gently, "it's time to unpack them." Alexander's hands tightened on his wheelchair's arms, but he didn't immediately reject the idea. "Maybe," he said finally. "Sophie, would you like to help me look for them?" As they made their way to the storage room, Julia noticed Richard watching from his study, his eyes bright with unshed tears. He quickly ducked back inside when he saw her looking, but not before she caught the hope in his expression. The storage room was vast, filled with carefully labeled boxes. Alexander directed them to a corner where several boxes marked Alexander Sports were stacked. As Sophie helped Julia carefully open them, Alexander remained slightly apart, his expression guarded but curious. "Look!" Sophie pulled out a gleaming medal. "It's so pretty. What's it for?" Alexander wheeled closer, taking the medal in his hands. "This one." This was from the National Championships, 200-meter freestyle. His voice was soft, lost in memory. "I can still remember the feeling of hitting the wall, looking up at the clock." "Were you scared?" Sophie asked, settling cross-legged on the floor beside his wheelchair. "Terrified," Alexander admitted, a small smile touching his lips, "but also excited. When you're in the water, everything else disappears. It's just you and the rhythm of your strokes, the burn in your muscles." Julia watched as Alexander continued talking, describing races and training sessions, answering Sophie's endless questions. With each memory shared, something in him seemed to soften, as if the act of remembering was slowly chipping away at the walls he'd built. "Do you miss it?" Sophie asked suddenly, with the direct innocence only a child could manage. Alexander's hands tightened around the medal. "Every day," he whispered. "But you can still swim," Sophie said, frowning. "Maybe not the same way, but Mommy says there are lots of ways to do things. Like when I couldn't reach the top shelf, she showed me I could use a stool instead of giving up." Julia saw Alexander's sharp intake of breath, saw the way his eyes darted to her, and then away. She kept her expression neutral, letting the moment unfold naturally. "It's not that simple, Sophie," he said finally. "Why not?" Sophie persisted. "The pool is right there in the backyard. We could—" "Sophie," Julia interrupted gently, seeing the tension returning to Alexander's shoulders. "Why don't you go get ready for dinner? We can look at more medals another time." After Sophie left, Alexander sat in silence, the medal still in his hands. Finally he spoke, his voice rough. "She makes it sound so simple." "Children often do," Julia replied. "Sometimes they see possibilities we've trained ourselves to ignore. I haven't been in the pool since—" He trailed off, his knuckles white around the medal. "I know," Julia said softly, "but Sophie's right. There are other ways. When you're ready, we could—" "I'm not ready," he cut her off, but his voice lacked its usual sharp edge. Instead, he sounded tired, almost vulnerable. "Okay," Julia nodded, standing. "But when you are, I'll be here, and I happen to be certified in aquatic therapy." She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. "Julia?" "Yes. Thank you. For helping with the medals. And for not pushing." She smiled. That's what I'm here for, Mr. Thornfield. Alexander, he said quietly. You can call me Alexander. As Julia left the storage room, she didn't notice Victoria standing in the shadows of the hallway, her face twisted in a mixture of rage and calculation. Victoria pulled out her phone, typing a quick message. We need to speed up the timeline. She's becoming a problem. The evening air was heavy with the scent of jasmine as Julia walked through the garden, checking on Sophie's chrysalis before dinner. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, but her mind was on the afternoon's events in the storage room. Something had shifted in Alexander today, a small crack in the fortress he'd built around himself. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. Victoria emerged from the gathering shadows, her designer dress gleaming in the fading light. Ms. Martinez, Victoria's voice was honey-sweet, but her eyes were cold. I believe we need to have a conversation. Julia straightened, noting the calculated way Victoria positioned herself between her and the path back to the house. So of course, Mrs. Thornfield, how can I help you? You can help by remembering your place, Victoria said, her facade of politeness slipping slightly. You're a caregiver, not a miracle worker, and certainly not family. I'm very clear about my role here, Julia replied calmly. My priority is Alexander's well-being and recovery. Victoria stepped closer, her expensive perfume almost overwhelming in the evening air. Is it? Because from where I stand, it looks like you're trying to insert yourself and your daughter into a situation that doesn't concern you. Alexander is my husband and his care is my responsibility. A responsibility you've shown little interest in until now, Julia observed quietly. Victoria's eyes flashed. Careful, Ms. Martinez. You're very new here, and positions can be terminated, especially when the employee is found to be developing inappropriate attachments to their patients. Before Julia could respond, they heard the whir of Alexander's wheelchair on the garden path. He appeared around a corner, followed by Sophie, who was chattering excitedly about the chrysalis. Victoria's demeanor changed instantly, a bright smile spreading across her face. Darling, I was just having a lovely chat with Ms. Martinez about your progress. Alexander's eyes moved between the two women, noting the tension in Julia's shoulders, the artificial brightness of Victoria's smile. Were you? He asked, his voice neutral. Of course. I'm so pleased to see you out in the garden. Victoria moved to stand behind his wheelchair, placing her hands possessively on his shoulders. Julia noticed how he tensed at the touch, though Victoria seemed not to. Sophie, oblivious to the undercurrents, tugged at Alexander's sleeve. Can we check the chrysalis now? You promised. Sophie, Julia began, but Alexander cut her off. It's fine, he said, shrugging off Victoria's hands as he wheeled himself forward. I did promise. Victoria's smile froze as she watched Alexander moving away with Sophie, Julia following at a discreet distance. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she pulled it out to read a message from James. Everything is arranged. We move forward tonight. Inside the mansion, Richard watched the scene unfold from his study window. He'd witnessed Victoria's confrontation with Julia, though he couldn't hear the words exchanged. Something about Victoria's behavior had been setting off warning bells lately, and he'd finally decided to act on his suspicions. Picking up his phone, he dialed a number he hadn't used in years. Frank, it's Richard Thornfield. I need your team to do some discreet investigating. Start with my daughter-in-law's financial records, phone records, and any frequent contacts. Yes, it's urgent. At the chrysalis, Sophie was explaining to Alexander how the butterfly would emerge, her small hands gesturing animatedly. Miss Garcia says it has to struggle to get out. If you help it too much, its wings won't be strong enough to fly. Alexander was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. Finally, he said, Sometimes the hardest things we do make us stronger. Julia caught his eye over Sophie's head, saw the understanding there. He wasn't just talking about butterflies anymore. Exactly, Sophie beamed. And guess what? When it comes out, its wings are all wrinkled and wet, but it doesn't give up. It waits and tries until it can fly. Sophie, Julia said gently, it's getting dark. Time to head in for dinner. As they made their way back to the house, Alexander spoke quietly to Julia. Your daughter, she sees things differently than most people. She sees things as they are, Julia replied. Without all the complications we adults add. Victoria threatened you, didn't she? He asked suddenly. Julia hesitated, then nodded. She's concerned about boundaries. Alexander's laugh was bitter. Boundaries? That's rich, coming from her. He paused, then added more quietly. Be careful, Julia. Victoria. She's not what she seems. As they entered the mansion, none of them noticed the small red light blinking on Victoria's phone or the message she sent while watching them from the shadows. Do it tonight. No more waiting. The sun had set completely now, leaving the garden in darkness. The chrysalis hung silently in its corner, waiting for its moment of transformation, while inside the mansion other transformations, some beautiful, some dangerous, were already in motion. The Thornfield estate dining room was a study in tension that evening. Crystal glasses caught the light from the elaborate chandelier, creating prisms on the mahogany table, where 5 people sat in weighted silence. Richard at the head, Alexander to his right, Victoria beside him, and Julia and Sophie completing the tableau. So, Victoria's voice cut through the quiet, Alexander tells me you're a certified aquatic therapist, Ms. Martinez. How convenient. Julia met Victoria's gaze steadily. Yes, it's proven quite effective in rehabilitation. I bet it has, Victoria murmured, taking a delicate sip of wine. And how many of your patients have you become so personally involved with? Victoria. Alexander's voice held a warning tone that surprised everyone at the table, including himself. Sophie looked up from her plate, sensing the tension but not understanding it. Mr. Alexander, can we show everyone the medals we found today? Not now, sweetheart, Julia said gently, but Alexander spoke over her. Actually, I'd like that, he said, his voice stronger than it had been in months. Dad, remember that race in San Diego? The one where I broke the state record? Richard's face lit up. Of course, the commentators said they'd never seen anything like it. You were trailing in 3rd place until the final turn, and then... I think we've had enough talk of swimming, Victoria interrupted, her knuckles white around her wineglass. It's hardly appropriate given the circumstances. The silence that followed was deafening. Sophie looked between the adults, her small face confused. But Mr. Alexander said, Sophie, Victoria's voice was sharp, children should be seen and not heard. That's enough. Alexander's wheelchair scraped back from the table. You don't speak to her that way. Victoria laughed, a brittle sound. Darling, when did you become so protective of our staff's children? When they showed more genuine care than my own wife, Alexander replied, his voice quiet but firm. The room fell silent again, broken only by the soft clink of Richard setting down his fork. Perhaps, he said carefully, we should all take a moment to... A sudden crash from upstairs interrupted him. Julia noticed Victoria's hand twitch toward her phone, a fleeting expression of satisfaction crossing her face. I'll check what that was, Julia said, standing. No, Victoria said quickly, too quickly. I'm sure it's nothing, just the staff cleaning. But Julia was already moving, her instincts telling her something was wrong. She could hear footsteps following her. Alexander's wheelchair, Richard's steady gait. When they reached the 2nd floor, Julia's heart stopped. The door to her and Sophie's suite was open, and inside, chaos reigned. Drawers had been pulled out, contents scattered. Sophie's beloved butterfly decorations lay broken on the floor. Oh my God, Richard breathed. Sophie, who had followed them up, let out a small cry at the sight of her destroyed room. My butterflies. Alexander reached out, catching Sophie's hand before she could run into the mess. Stay back, sweetheart. There might be broken glass. Julia moved carefully through the destruction, her heart pounding. At first glance it looked like a robbery, but something felt off. Nothing valuable had been taken. Her laptop sat untouched on the desk, her jewelry box unopened. This was about sending a message. I'll call the police, Richard said, pulling out his phone. No. Victoria appeared in the doorway, slightly out of breath. I mean, surely that's not necessary. It's probably just a disgruntled former employee. We can handle this internally. Julia turned slowly, meeting Victoria's gaze. In that moment, understanding passed between them. This wasn't a random act of vandalism. Actually, Julia said calmly, I think the police should be called, especially since this seems targeted. Victoria's phone buzzed in her hand. She glanced at it, her face paling slightly. "If you'll excuse me, I need to make a call." As Victoria hurried away, Richard was already on the phone with the police. Alexander wheeled himself closer to Julia, who was holding a crying Sophie. "You don't seem surprised," he said quietly. "No," Julia replied, her voice equally low. "I'm not. Stay in my wing tonight," Alexander said suddenly. When Julia looked at him in surprise, he added, "Both of you, it's safer and I have the space, please." Before Julia could respond, Sophie spoke through her tears. "Can we save any of the butterflies?" Alexander reached out, brushing a tear from Sophie's cheek. "We'll get you new ones, better ones, I promise." Richard finished his call and approached them. "The police are on their way." "Julia, I think Alexander's right. You and Sophie should stay in his wing tonight, and tomorrow we'll have additional security installed." As they helped Sophie gather what she needed for the night, Julia caught sight of her reflection in a broken mirror. In it, she could see Alexander watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Concern, certainly, but something else too. Something that made her heart beat a little faster. Outside the mansion, in the darkness of the garden, Victoria spoke urgently into her phone. "You idiots! You were supposed to find the files, not trash the place like common thugs. No, listen to me. The police are coming. We need to—" "Yes, I understand that, but no, don't call me again tonight. I'll contact you when it's safe." She ended the call, unaware that Richard's security cameras had captured every word, every gesture. In his study, a small red light blinked on his computer monitor, recording everything. The night settled over Thornfield Estate like a heavy blanket, full of unspoken tensions and shifting allegiances. In Alexander's wing, Sophie finally fell asleep on the comfortable sofa, while Julia and Alexander sat in companionable silence, watching the moonlight paint shadows on the wall. "Thank you," Julia said softly, careful not to wake Sophie. Alexander's hand moved as if to reach for hers, then stopped. "I should be thanking you," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. "You and Sophie. You've brought something back to this house, something I thought was gone forever." "What's that?" He was quiet for a long moment, watching Sophie sleep. "Hope," he finally said. "You've brought back hope." In the pre-dawn hours, Alexander found himself unable to sleep. From his bedroom, he could hear the soft breathing of Sophie on the sofa in his sitting room, and the occasional rustle as Julia shifted in the guest room. Their presence in his wing of the mansion felt both strange and somehow right, like pieces of a puzzle finally falling into place. He wheeled himself to the window, watching the moon cast silver light over the garden below. The events of the evening played through his mind. The dinner, the destruction of Julia's rooms, Victoria's strange behavior. Something wasn't adding up. A soft knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called quietly. Julia appeared, wrapped in a borrowed robe. "I heard you moving around." "Couldn't sleep either." "Too much on my mind," he admitted. "How's Sophie?" "Finally sleeping soundly." Julia moved to stand beside his wheelchair, looking out at the moonlit garden. "She's stronger than people think, than I think sometimes." "Like her mother," Alexander said softly. Julia turned to look at him, surprised by the warmth in his voice. "Alexander, I know what Victoria did," he said suddenly. "The room, it wasn't random. She's trying to scare you away." "I know," Julia replied, "but why? What is she so afraid of?" Alexander was quiet for a long moment, his hands gripping the arms of his wheelchair. I think she's afraid of losing control, of losing her claim to the estate." "What do you mean?" He took a deep breath. "There's something I haven't told anyone. The night of my accident. It wasn't completely random. I had confronted Victoria about some suspicious transfers from our joint account, large sums of money being moved to an offshore account." Julia's breath caught. "Did you tell your father?" "I was going to the next day. But then the accident happened and everything changed. I was so caught up in my own misery, my own helplessness." He laughed bitterly. "I let her take control of everything while I wallowed in self-pity. And now?" "Now." He looked up at her, his eyes intense in the moonlight. "Now I'm starting to see things clearly again. Thanks to you. And Sophie." Julia felt her heart skip a beat at the way he was looking at her. "Alexander, A sound from the sitting room interrupted them. Sophie stood in the doorway, rubbing her eyes. "Mommy, I had a bad dream." Julia moved to go to her daughter, but Alexander was already wheeling himself forward. "Come here, Butterfly," he said softly, using the nickname that had somehow developed over the past few days. Sophie climbed into his lap without hesitation, something she'd never done before. Julia watched, her heart clenching, as Alexander wrapped a gentle arm around the little girl. "Want to know what I do when I have bad dreams?" he asked. Sophie nodded against his chest. "I look out at the garden and count the stars. Want to try?" As they counted stars together, Julia watched the scene unfold with a mixture of joy and trepidation. She was falling for him, had been falling for him since that first day when she saw past his anger to the pain beneath. But now, seeing him with Sophie, the feelings were becoming impossible to ignore. 43 stars, Sophie announced sleepily. "That's a lucky number." "Is it?" Alexander smiled, catching Julia's eye over Sophie's head. "That's how many butterflies we're going to see come out of their chrysalises. Miss Garcia says so." "Well, if Miss Garcia says so, it must be true," Alexander replied, his voice gentle. As Sophie drifted back to sleep in Alexander's lap, Julia moved to take her, but he shook his head. "Let her stay," he whispered. I like having her here." Julia sat in the chair beside them, and together they watched the moon move across the sky. Neither spoke of the growing feelings between them, of the way their hands had somehow found each other in the darkness, fingers intertwined. In another part of the mansion, Victoria paced in her room, her phone pressed to her ear. "James, listen to me. The police are involved now. We need to move faster. No, I don't care about the risks anymore. She's ruining everything. That woman and her brat are making him remember who he used to be, and I can't... Yes, I understand the complications, but... Fine, yes. Tomorrow, then." She ended the call and moved to her window, which overlooked Alexander's wing. Her eyes narrowed as she saw the lights still on, the shadows of figures moving within. Her perfectly manicured nails dug into her palms as she watched, unaware that in his study, Richard was reviewing security footage that would soon change everything. The night deepened, full of secrets and unspoken truths. In Alexander's room, Sophie slept peacefully in his lap, while he and Julia sat in comfortable silence, their joined hands a promise of something new beginning, even as darker forces gathered around them. The early morning sun filtered through the windows of Alexander's wing, casting warm light on an unexpected scene. Sophie was still curled up in Alexander's wheelchair, while he had moved to the sofa sometime during the night. Julia had fallen asleep in the armchair beside them, her hand still loosely holding his. Richard stood in the doorway, taking in the scene with mixed emotions. He'd come to share what he'd discovered in the security footage, but seeing them like this, peaceful, connected, made him hesitate. It had been so long since he'd seen his son look this at peace. A noise in the hallway made him turn. Victoria stood there, perfectly dressed despite the early hour, her face darkening at the scene before her. "This is completely inappropriate," she hissed, moving to enter the room. Richard caught her arm. "My study. Now." Something in his tone made Victoria pause. She glanced once more at the sleeping figures before following Richard to his study. He closed the door behind them, moving to his computer. "Would you care to explain this?" He played the security footage from the garden, Victoria's voice clear as she spoke on the phone about the break-in. Victoria's face remained composed, but her hands trembled slightly. "I don't know what you're implying, Richard. I was merely expressing concern about—" "Save it," Richard interrupted, his voice hard. "I've had my security team investigating you for weeks. The offshore accounts, the meetings with James Peterson, the suspicious timing of Alexander's accident. You can't prove anything," Victoria said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Actually, I can. And I will, unless you leave this house today. Leave Alexander, leave everything behind and never come back." Victoria's carefully maintained facade cracked. "You can't do this to me. I've invested too much time, too much plotting." Richard's voice was cold. "Too much manipulation. Get out of my house, Victoria, before I call the police with everything I've found." In Alexander's wing, Julia stirred awake to find Sophie and Alexander already up, sharing quiet conversation over a breakfast tray that had been delivered. "Morning, sleepyhead," Alexander smiled, and Julia's heart skipped at how natural this felt, how right. We saved you pancakes, Mummy, Sophie announced, carefully cutting her own stack into butterfly shapes. I see that, Julia smiled, moving to join them. And how long have you two been up? Long enough to make some important decisions, Alexander said, his voice serious but his eyes twinkling. Sophie has convinced me that it's time to try the pool. Julia's breath caught. Are you sure? No, he admitted, but I want to try, with your help, both of you. Before Julia could respond, they heard raised voices from down the hall, Victoria's voice, sharp with anger, followed by Richard's calmer tones. Stay here, Julia said, moving toward the door, but Alexander caught her hand. Together, he said firmly. We face things together now. They made their way to Richard's study, Sophie walking between them just in time to see Victoria storming out, her face twisted with rage. This isn't over, she snarled when she saw them. You think you've won? You have no idea what's coming. Actually, Richard emerged from his study holding a USB drive. I think we do. Every conversation, every meeting, every transaction, it's all here, Victoria. Leave now while you still can. Victoria's gaze darted between them. Richard's stern face, Alexander's determined expression, Julia's protective stance in front of Sophie. For a moment, something like regret flashed across her features. Then she straightened, smoothing her designer dress. Fine. You want me gone? I'm gone. But don't think this ends here. As she clicked down the hallway on her expensive heels, Sophie tugged on Alexander's sleeve. Is the mean lady leaving? Yes, Butterfly, he said softly, pulling her close. She's leaving. Julia caught Richard's eye, saw the worry there despite their apparent victory. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Well, Alexander said, his voice deliberately light, I believe we had a date with a swimming pool? Sophie's face lit up. Really? Now? No time like the present, he said, but Julia could hear the nervousness beneath his confident tone. One step at a time, she said softly, placing her hand on his shoulder. Richard watched them move toward the pool area, his heart full but his mind troubled. He looked down at the USB drive in his hand, knowing it contained enough evidence to destroy Victoria completely, but something told him she wouldn't go quietly. In the garden, the morning sun caught the chrysalis, now visibly changed. Soon, very soon, it would break free. Like the butterfly within, they were all on the verge of transformation, some beautiful, some dangerous. Victoria's car roared out of the driveway, gravel spraying. She pulled out her phone, dialing with shaking fingers. James, it's happening now. Plan B. And don't hold back. The morning light continued to fill Thornfield Estate, warming the pool where Alexander was about to take his first step toward reclaiming his life, unaware that somewhere in the city, dark plans were being set in motion. The indoor pool at Thornfield Estate had been Alexander's sanctuary before the accident. Now, sitting in his wheelchair at the edge, he felt his heart racing. The water gleamed invitingly, but all he could see were the limitations, the possibilities for failure. Julia knelt beside his chair, already in her swimsuit with a professional swim instructor's vest over it. Remember what we talked about? We go at your pace, no pressure. Sophie, sitting with her feet dangling in the shallow end, called out, The water's perfect, Mr. Alexander, like butterfly wings. A small smile touched Alexander's lips despite his anxiety. Butterfly wings, huh? Everything's butterflies with you two lately, Julia teased gently, helping him position the wheelchair near the pool lift they'd had installed that morning. As Julia helped him onto the lift, Alexander caught her hand. Wait, he said softly. I need to tell you something. Last night, when we were talking, there's more to the story about Victoria. Julia saw the seriousness in his eyes. Sophie, honey, why don't you go see if Richard has those special pool toys he mentioned? Once Sophie had bounced away, Alexander continued, his voice low. The night of my accident, I didn't just find suspicious transfers. I found emails. Victoria was working with someone, planning something. I confronted her and then... He swallowed hard. The next day, my brakes failed on that turn. Julia's hand tightened on his. Are you saying... I can't prove anything, he said quickly. But now, with what Dad found... We need to be careful, Julia finished. She's not going to just walk away. No, he agreed, but right now I don't want to think about Victoria. Right now I want to try this with you, Sophie returned, clutching an armful of colorful pool noodles. Look what Richard found. He said these will help you float. The tension broke as they laughed at Sophie's enthusiasm. Julia helped Alexander transfer from the lift into the water, supporting him as he adjusted to the sensation he hadn't felt in so long. How does it feel? She asked softly. Alexander was quiet for a moment, feeling the water support his weight. Like coming home, he finally said, his voice thick with emotion. They started with simple exercises, Julia supporting him as he began to remember what his body could do in the water. Sophie cheered from the side, occasionally demonstrating her own version of the exercises, making them both laugh. You're a natural teacher, Alexander said to Sophie during a rest break. Maybe you should help your mum with her other patients. Sophie beamed. Really? Could I, Mommy? We'll see. Julia smiled, but her heart warmed at the way Alexander included Sophie, the way he was building a future that included them both. From the doorway, Richard watched the scene unfold, his phone pressed to his ear. Yes, I understand the risks, he was saying quietly. But I want everything ready if Victoria tries anything, and yes, full security detail, background checks on everyone. No, we can't be too careful. In the pool, Alexander was making his first attempt at floating independently, Julia's hands hovering nearby but not touching. Trust the water, she encouraged. It remembers you. And somehow it did. His body remembered the rhythm, the balance, the peace that came with surrendering to the water's embrace. Tears mixed with pool water on his face as he floated, truly floated, for the first time since the accident. You're doing it, Sophie clapped. Just like the butterfly coming out of its chrysalis. Alexander laughed, the sound echoing off the pool walls. I suppose I am, Butterfly. I suppose I am. Later, as Julia helped him back into his wheelchair, Alexander caught her hand again. Thank you, he said simply. For what? For seeing me. Not the chair, not the accident, just me. Their eyes met, and for a moment the air seemed charged with possibility. Sophie's voice broke the moment. Mommy, Mr. Alexander, look, Richard brought lunch. They turned to see Richard entering with a picnic basket, his face determined to keep things light, despite the security team they could see patrolling outside the windows. I thought we could celebrate, Richard said, setting up a poolside lunch. Small steps are still steps forward. As they shared lunch by the pool, none of them noticed the small red light blinking on one of the security cameras. In a van parked several blocks away, James watched the feed on his laptop, Victoria's words echoing in his head. Find their weakness. Everyone has one. But looking at the scene, the small family unit they were becoming, the way Alexander's face had lost its hardness, the protective way Julia watched them all, James wondered if perhaps their greatest weakness was becoming their greatest strength. The afternoon sun played on the pool water, creating patterns that danced on the walls like butterfly wings in flight. Change was coming for all of them. The only question was whether it would bring destruction or transformation. The evening brought a sense of unease to Thornfield Estate. Security guards patrolled the perimeter, their presence both reassuring and disturbing. Inside, Richard sat in his study, reviewing financial documents with growing concern. The web Victoria had woven was more complex than he'd initially realized. A knock at his door made him look up. Come in. Julia entered, her face troubled. Sophie's finally asleep. Alexander's been helping her design a butterfly garden for when the chrysalis opens. She paused, noting Richard's expression. What's wrong? Richard sighed, gesturing to the papers spread across his desk. Victoria's been busy. The offshore accounts, the suspicious transfers, they're just the beginning. She's been systematically siphoning funds, creating a complex network of shell companies. How long? Since before the accident, Richard's voice was heavy. I should have seen it, all those shopping trips, the excessive spending. She was building her escape route. Julia sat in the chair across from him. Alexander told me about the emails he found before the accident. Richard's head snapped up. What emails? He said he confronted Victoria about them the night before the accident. Something about her planning something with someone. Richard's face paled. The brakes. We always assumed it was a mechanical failure, but... He reached for his phone. I need to call my investigator. Before he could dial, a commotion erupted from the direction of Alexander's wing. They rushed to find Alexander in the hallway, his face tight with anger, holding a piece of paper. "She's threatening Sophie," he said, his voice shaking. "This was slipped under my door." Julia's heart stopped as she read the note. Such a shame if anything happened to the little butterfly lover. Children are so fragile. "Where is she?" Julia's voice was barely controlled. "With Mrs. Reynolds," Alexander assured her. "I asked her to stay with Sophie when I found the note." Richard was already on the phone with security. "Double the patrols. No one enters or leaves without clearance. And get me Detective Morris." Julia knelt beside Alexander's wheelchair. "We should tell Sophie we need to stay inside for a few days." "Already done," Alexander said, reaching for her hand. "I told her we're having a special indoor butterfly observation week. She's excited about it." Julia felt tears prick her eyes at his thoughtfulness, his instinctive protection of her daughter. "Julia," he said softly, "I won't let anything happen to either of you. I can't lose you. Either of you." Richard ended his call, turning to them. "Detective Morris is on her way, and I've arranged for additional security measures." A soft voice interrupted them. "Mummy!" They turned to see Sophie in her butterfly pajamas, Mrs. Reynolds hovering anxiously behind her. "I'm sorry," the housekeeper said. "She insisted on saying goodnight again." "Come here, Butterfly." Alexander opened his arms, and Sophie climbed into his lap without hesitation. "Are you scared?" she asked, touching his face with small fingers. "You look scared." "No, sweetheart," he said, but his arms tightened around her. "Just thinking about how lucky I am to have you and your mum in my life." Julia watched them, her heart full despite the fear. They had become a family, somehow, in these few weeks. The thought of Victoria threatening that— "Richard," she said suddenly, "the security cameras in the garden, do they cover the butterfly chrysalis?" Richard's eyes widened in understanding. "Yes, and they're monitored 24/7 now. Nothing will happen to it." Sophie yawned, snuggling closer to Alexander. "Can we check on it tomorrow?" "Of course," Alexander promised. "But for now, how about a bedtime story?" As they made their way back to his wing, now their shared sanctuary, Julia caught sight of something through the window. A shadow moved in the garden, quickly disappearing behind a hedge. "Richard," she said quietly, "I think we have company." Richard was already signaling to security. As guards moved to investigate, Alexander wheeled himself closer to the window, Sophie now asleep in his lap. "They're watching us," he said softly, "testing our defenses." Julia placed a hand on his shoulder, feeling the tension there. "Then we'll be ready." In the garden, the security team found nothing but footprints in the soft earth near the butterfly chrysalis. And pinned to the branch next to it, another note: "Everything changes, everything dies." Richard ordered the note be bagged as evidence, but not before taking a photo and sending it to his investigator. The pieces were coming together, forming a pattern more sinister than any of them had imagined. Back in Alexander's wing, as they settled Sophie into bed, Julia couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Alexander seemed to sense her unease. "Stay close tonight," he said, his voice low. "Both of you." As the night deepened around Thornfield Estate, security lights cast long shadows across the garden. In the darkness, the chrysalis waited for its moment of transformation, unaware of the human drama unfolding around it. Like the butterfly within, they were all suspended between what was and what would be, waiting for the next move in a game where the stakes kept rising. Morning brought Detective Morris to Thornfield Estate, her sharp eyes taking in every detail as Richard laid out the evidence. The threatening notes, the security footage, the financial records, a pattern of escalating danger. "And you're certain Mrs. Thornfield is behind this?" the detective asked, reviewing the documents. "Victoria isn't acting alone," Richard explained. "We've identified her accomplice, James Peterson. He's been helping her orchestrate everything, including my accident," Alexander finished, wheeling into the study with Julia beside him. "We have reason to believe it wasn't an accident at all." Detective Morris's expression sharpened. "That's a serious accusation, Mr. Thornfield. Do you have evidence?" "Emails," Alexander replied. "I confronted Victoria about them the night before the accident. The next day, my brakes failed on a turn I'd taken hundreds of times." Julia watched as Alexander recounted that day, noting how his hands gripped his wheelchair's arms less tightly when she placed her hand on his shoulder. "Where's Sophie?" Richard asked suddenly. "With Mrs. Reynolds in the conservatory," Julia assured him. "They're working on a surprise for Alexander." Alexander's face softened at the mention of Sophie. "She's been so brave through all this." "Children often are," Detective Morris observed. "Now, about these emails." A commotion from the conservatory interrupted them. Mrs. Reynolds appeared in the doorway, her face pale. "Sophie, she was just here, but now—" Julia's heart stopped. Alexander was already wheeling toward the door, his face tight with fear. "Security teams are already searching," Richard announced, checking his phone. "The estate is locked down. She has to be here somewhere." They split up to search, Julia's heart pounding with each empty room they checked. Alexander led the way to the butterfly garden, something in his expression suggesting he knew. They found Sophie there, unharmed but crying, staring at the branch where the chrysalis had been. In its place was another note. A choice, the child or the evidence. "You have 1 hour." "Oh, baby," Julia gathered Sophie into her arms. "You can't wander off like that." "But the butterfly," Sophie sobbed. "It was ready to come out." "I wanted to see it." Alexander wheeled closer, his face a mix of relief and determination. "Sophie, look at me." When she did, he continued, "We'll find the chrysalis, I promise. But you have to promise to stay close to us, okay?" Detective Morris was already photographing the note, calling for forensics. "This is escalating faster than we anticipated. We need to move you all to a secure location." "No," Alexander said firmly. "We're not running. This ends here." Richard's phone buzzed with a text. His face darkened as he read it. "Victoria wants a meeting. Just me, at the old boathouse by the lake." "It's a trap," Julia said immediately. "Of course it is," Richard agreed. "But it's also our chance to end this." Alexander shook his head. "Dad, you can't—" "I can and I will," Richard cut him off. "I let this happen. I didn't see what Victoria was doing to this family. It's time I fixed that." Detective Morris was already coordinating with her team. "We'll have undercover officers in position. The moment we have evidence of extortion or conspiracy—" "I want to help," Alexander interrupted. When they all turned to look at him, he continued, "I have an idea, but I'll need Julia's help." Julia met his eyes, understanding dawning. "The pool therapy." "Yes," he nodded. "Victoria doesn't know about my progress. She still thinks I'm completely dependent on the chair." Sophie, who had been quiet, suddenly spoke up, "Like the butterfly in the chrysalis. Everyone thinks it's stuck, but really it's getting stronger." Alexander smiled, pulling her close. "Exactly like that, butterfly." As they formulated their plan, Julia couldn't help but notice how natural it felt, the four of them working together. Even in this moment of crisis, they were a family. 1 hour, Detective Morris reminded them, checking her watch. Richard straightened his jacket. "Then we better get started." As they moved inside to prepare, Alexander caught Julia's hand. "Stay with me, whatever happens." "Always," she promised, her heart racing at the intensity in his eyes. Sophie, still holding the empty branch where the chrysalis had been, looked up at them. "The butterfly will be okay, right?" Alexander touched the branch gently. "Sometimes, butterfly, the strongest wings come from the hardest struggles." The morning sun caught the dew on the garden flowers, making them sparkle like tears or hopes or promises. In 1 hour, everything would change. Like the butterfly they couldn't see but knew was struggling toward freedom. They were all on the verge of transformation. Victoria waited by the old boathouse, unaware that her carefully laid plans were about to encounter something she hadn't counted on. The strength of a family bound not by blood or law, but by love. The old boathouse stood at the edge of the Thornfield Estate lake, its weathered wood holding memories of happier times. Richard approached it alone, his footsteps echoing on the wooden dock. Victoria waited inside, her elegant silhouette visible through the dusty windows. "Right on time," she said as he entered, her voice carrying that familiar false sweetness. "Always so predictable, Richard." "Where's the chrysalis, Victoria?" Richard's voice was steady, despite the anger he felt. Victoria laughed, the sound echoing in the empty boathouse. "Straight to business? No small talk?" "The chrysalis is safe, for now. Just like that precious little girl." "Leave Sophie out of this," Richard warned. "She's an innocent child." "No one is innocent," Victoria snapped, her composure cracking slightly. "You took everything from me. My position, my future, my—" "You mean the future you planned to steal?" Richard interrupted. "We know everything, Victoria. The offshore accounts, the shell companies, the emails about Alexander's accident." Victoria's face paled slightly, but she recovered quickly. "Prove it." "You can't prove any of it. But I can prove that you're harboring an inappropriate relationship between a caregiver and a patient. How would the board of directors feel about that?" "Is that really what this is about?" Richard asked quietly. "Or is it about the fact that Alexander is healing, that he's finding happiness without you? He was supposed to stay broken." Victoria's voice rose sharply. "The accident was perfect, just enough damage to keep him dependent, to keep him under control until—" She stopped abruptly, realizing what she'd revealed. Richard's hand moved to his jacket pocket, where a small recording device blinked silently. "Until what, Victoria? Until I was gone and you could control everything?" Meanwhile, in the indoor pool area, Alexander was working with Julia, his movements in the water becoming stronger, more confident. "Are you sure about this?" Julia asked, supporting him as he practiced standing in the shallow end. "No," he admitted, "but I'm sure about us, about what we're fighting for." Sophie watched from the pool edge, swinging her legs in the water. "Like the butterfly, right? It has to fight to get strong." "Exactly, butterfly." Alexander smiled at her. His legs trembled with effort, but he remained standing. "How much longer?" Julia checked her phone. 20 minutes until the signal. Detective Morris has her team in position. In the boathouse, Victoria was pacing, her expensive heels clicking on the wooden floor. "You don't understand what it's like, Richard. Being married to a man who gave up, who wouldn't even try to get better. And then she comes along with her perfect little daughter and her hope." "Alexander didn't give up," Richard corrected. "You wanted him to give up. You needed him broken to maintain control." Victoria's phone buzzed. She checked it, a smile spreading across her face. "Well, it doesn't matter now. James has the evidence. One word from me and it all disappears. The chrysalis, the emails, everything that could prove what really happened that day." "You mean the day you had James tamper with Alexander's car?" Richard's voice was deadly quiet. Victoria froze. "I never said you didn't have to. We found the mechanic, Victoria. He remembered James very well. Remembered the specific instructions about the brake line." For the first time, real fear flashed across Victoria's face. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" Richard moved toward the door. "Detective Morris and her team are waiting outside. They've heard everything." Victoria's composure shattered. She lunged for her phone, but Richard was faster. In the struggle, the phone skittered across the floor, sliding into a gap between the wooden planks and falling into the lake below with a soft plop. "No!" Victoria screamed. "Do you know what you've done? Stopped you from warning James?" "Yes." That was the idea. At the pool, Julia helped Alexander into his wheelchair. His legs were tired from the exercises, but his eyes were determined. "Remember," she said softly, "you don't have to do this." "Yes, I do," he replied, taking her hand. "For us. For Sophie. For everything she tried to take away." Sophie hugged him tightly. "Be careful, Mr. Alexander. Butterflies need their whole family." His eyes met Julia's over Sophie's head, and the love he saw there gave him strength. "Let's end this," he said. Detective Morris's voice crackled over the radio. "Target B is approaching the secondary location. All units in position." Victoria's perfectly maintained facade had crumbled completely. "You've ruined everything," she spat at Richard. "Everything I worked for, everything I planned." "No, Victoria," came a voice from the doorway. "You did that yourself." Alexander wheeled himself into the boathouse, Julia beside him, Detective Morris and her team following close behind. Victoria's eyes widened at the sight of her husband, at the strength in his bearing that hadn't been there before. "Alexander, what, how—" "Surprised to see me out of my wing?" he asked, his voice steady. "Surprised I'm not the broken man you tried to create?" As Victoria looked between them, Richard with the recording device, Alexander no longer defeated, the police closing in, her world began to crumble. Like a butterfly emerging too soon, her carefully constructed plans were falling apart, leaving her exposed and vulnerable. The morning sun streamed through the boathouse windows, catching the ripples where her phone had disappeared into the lake. carrying its secrets into the depths. But some secrets, like some transformations, refuse to stay hidden forever. Detective Morris stepped forward, her badge catching the light. Victoria Thornfield, you're under arrest for conspiracy, attempted murder, and financial fraud. Victoria's eyes darted around the boathouse, looking for escape routes, but she was surrounded. You can't prove anything. James has all the evidence. You mean this evidence? Alexander held up a familiar USB drive. The one you had him steal from Julia's room? Dad made copies. Multiple copies. And the real emails, Richard added. The ones Alexander found before the accident? They're with the FBI now. Your friend James was very cooperative once we found him. Victoria's face went chalk white. James? What do you mean? He turned himself in an hour ago, Detective Morris explained, producing handcuffs. Brought quite an interesting collection of documents with him, including detailed plans for Alexander's accident. As the detective began reading Victoria her rights, Alexander wheeled closer to his wife. I want to know why, he said quietly. Was it all just about the money? Victoria laughed, a brittle sound. Money? It was about power, Alexander, control. You were supposed to need me, depend on me. But then she came along. She glared at Julia. She and that brat of hers, making you remember who you were. Sophie, Alexander corrected sharply, helped me remember who I could be. Julia showed me I wasn't broken. They gave me back my life, the life you tried to steal. Your life? Victoria sneered. You can't even walk. Alexander met Julia's eyes, and she nodded encouragingly. Slowly, gripping the arms of his wheelchair, he stood. His legs trembled with effort, but he remained upright. Victoria's eyes widened in shock. How? Physical therapy, Julia explained professionally. Aquatic rehabilitation, and something you never gave him. Belief in himself. Take her, Detective Morris ordered her team. As they led Victoria away, she turned back one last time. The chrysalis, she said. You'll never find it in time. Some transformations get cut short. Alexander watched through the boathouse window as they escorted Victoria to the waiting police car. She's wrong, he said softly. About everything. A small voice called from outside. Daddy, Mommy, look. They all turned to see Sophie standing in the garden, pointing excitedly at something. There, on a branch near where the original had been, was the missing chrysalis, and it was moving. How did you... Julia began. I followed the mean lady's footprints, Sophie explained proudly. She didn't hide it very well. Can we watch it open? Alexander sank back into his wheelchair, exhausted from standing but happy. Of course we can, Butterfly. They gathered in the garden, Alexander, Julia, Sophie, and Richard, watching as the chrysalis began to split. Slowly, delicately, a monarch butterfly emerged, its wings still wet and crumpled. Why isn't it flying? Sophie whispered. It needs time, Julia explained, wrapping her arms around her daughter. Time to dry its wings to gather its strength. Like you, Mr. Alexander? Sophie asked innocently. Alexander reached for Julia's hand, squeezing it gently. Exactly like that, Butterfly. Some transformations can't be rushed. Richard watched the scene with moist eyes, his son stronger than ever, Julia, whose love had helped heal not just Alexander, but their whole family, and Sophie, whose innocent wisdom had shown them all how to see beauty in change. Look, Sophie pointed as the butterfly's wings began to spread, catching the sunlight. It's ready. They watched in wonder as the butterfly opened its wings fully for the first time. For a moment it seemed to pause, as if gathering courage. Then, with a gentle movement, it took flight. Beautiful, Julia breathed, leaning against Alexander's wheelchair. Yes, he agreed, but he wasn't looking at the butterfly. His eyes were on Julia and Sophie, on the family he'd found when he thought he'd lost everything. Detective Morris approached quietly. We'll need statements from all of you, and there will be a trial. Later, Richard said firmly. Right now, we're watching a miracle. The butterfly circled once above them before floating away on the morning breeze. Sophie waved goodbye, then turned to Alexander with shining eyes. Can we help more butterflies make a whole garden full? Alexander pulled her into his lap, looking at Julia with all the love in his heart. I think that's a wonderful idea, Butterfly. A fresh start for all of us. The morning sun warmed the garden, touching everything with gold, the flowers, the trees, and the small family who had weathered their own transformation, emerging stronger, together. Like the butterfly now soaring free, they had fought their way out of darkness into light, proving that sometimes the most beautiful changes come from the hardest struggles. 1 month after Victoria's arrest, Thornfield Estate buzzed with a different kind of energy. The gardens, once sterile and lifeless, now bloomed with purpose. Sophie's butterfly garden had expanded, with Alexander directing operations from his wheelchair, though he spent less and less time in it each day. A little to the left, he called out to the gardeners installing a new butterfly house. We want the morning sun to hit it just right. Julia watched from the terrace, her heart full. The transformation wasn't just in the gardens, it was in Alexander himself. His physical therapy was progressing remarkably, but it was the change in his spirit that moved her most deeply. "Daddy!" Sophie's voice rang out across the garden. She had started calling him that a week ago, and the joy it brought to Alexander's face still made Julia's eyes water. "Look what Miss Garcia helped me make." She ran up to his wheelchair, carefully holding a detailed diagram of butterfly species. Alexander examined it with exaggerated seriousness, making Sophie giggle. "This is excellent work, Butterfly," he praised. "We'll have to make sure we plant all the right flowers to attract each species." "Already working on it," Richard approached, consulting a tablet. "The landscapers have the full plan. Though I think someone," he winked at Sophie, "added extra purple flowers because they're her favorite." "Purple is clearly the superior color," Alexander agreed solemnly, making Sophie beam. Julia moved to join them, and Alexander immediately reached for her hand. These casual touches had become natural, necessary, like breathing. "The detective called," she said quietly. "Victoria's trial is set for next month." Alexander's hand tightened briefly on hers, but his voice remained steady. "We'll face it together, all of us." "Speaking of together," Richard cleared his throat. "The board meeting went well. They're fully supportive of your return to the company, Alexander, at your own pace, of course." Alexander nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I've been thinking about that, about making some changes to the company's focus." "Oh?" Richard raised an eyebrow. "I want to start a foundation," Alexander explained, "focusing on rehabilitation technology, making it more accessible and—" He glanced at Julia. "I was hoping you might help me develop an aquatic therapy program." Julia's heart skipped. "Are you sure? Combining personal and professional is exactly what makes sense," he finished. "Your expertise, my experience, and we could help so many people." "And I can help too," Sophie chimed in. "I'm really good at making people smile." "That you are, Butterfly," Alexander laughed, pulling her into his lap. "That you are." Richard watched them, his eyes suspiciously bright. "I'll have legal draw up the paperwork for the foundation, but first," he pulled an envelope from his jacket. "There's something else we need to discuss." Julia recognized the papers inside. Adoption papers. Alexander had mentioned wanting to legally adopt Sophie, but seeing the actual documents made it real in a way that caught her breath. "Only if you both want this," Alexander said quickly, looking between Julia and Sophie. "I know we haven't known each other long, but family isn't about time," Sophie said wisely, surprising them all. "It's about love. Miss Garcia taught us that." "Miss Garcia is very wise," Julia managed through her tears. "And yes, we want this. All of it." Alexander's smile could have lit up the entire garden. "Then there's something else I need to do." He glanced at Richard, who nodded encouragingly. With determination, Alexander pushed himself up from his wheelchair. His legs were stronger now, though he still needed support for longer periods. But for this moment he wanted to stand. Julia moved to help him, but he shook his head. "I need to do this part myself." Slowly, carefully, he lowered himself to one knee, pulling a small box from his pocket. Sophie gasped in delight, and Richard discreetly wiped his eyes. "Julia Martinez." Alexander's voice was steady despite the effort of kneeling. "You came into my life when I thought I was broken beyond repair. You and Sophie showed me that being broken just means having the chance to rebuild something even stronger." He opened the box, revealing a ring with a butterfly design in the setting. "Will you marry me?" "Both of you?" Sophie was bouncing with excitement, but she looked to her mother first. Julia felt tears running down her face as she nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes to everything." As Alexander slipped the ring onto her finger, Sophie threw her arms around them both, nearly knocking them over. Richard steadied them, laughing through his own tears. "Miss Garcia says happy tears make butterflies dance," Sophie announced, making them all laugh. The garden around them seemed to glow in the afternoon light. Where Victoria had once paced and plotted, new life was blooming. Where darkness had threatened to overwhelm them, love had found a way to shine through. Alexander pulled Julia close, whispering, "Thank you for helping me find my wings again." Above them, butterflies danced in the sunshine, free and beautiful, just like the love that had transformed Thornfield Estate from a place of shadows into a home filled with light. The autumn air was crisp as final preparations were made in the Thornfield Estate garden. White chairs lined the newly laid paths, and an arch covered in Sophie's beloved purple flowers marked the spot where 2 lives, 3 lives, would officially become one. Inside the mansion, Julia stood before a mirror in what had once been Victoria's dressing room, now transformed like everything else in the estate. Her wedding dress was simple but elegant, with subtle butterfly embroidery at the hem, Sophie's special request. "Almost ready?" Richard appeared in the doorway, his eyes misty. Over the past months, he had become like a father to her, making this moment even more special. "Just waiting for my flower girl," Julia smiled. "Is she still with Alexander?" Giving him very serious instructions about his vows, Richard chuckled. "That daughter of yours, soon to be officially my granddaughter, has quite the executive personality." As if summoned by their conversation, Sophie burst in, her purple flower girl dress swishing. "Mommy, Daddy said I can release the butterflies when you say I do." The butterfly release had been Sophie's idea, raising and releasing monarch butterflies as part of the ceremony. It was perfect, really, a symbol of their journey together. "Is he nervous?" Julia asked, adjusting Sophie's butterfly hair clip. "Nope," Sophie announced proudly. "He said he's never been more sure of anything." And guess what? He practiced walking down the whole aisle this morning. Julia's heart swelled. Alexander had worked tirelessly with his physical therapy, determined to walk to meet her at the altar. He still used the wheelchair for longer periods, but his progress had been remarkable. A knock at the door revealed Detective Morris, now a friend, in her dress uniform. "Everyone decent?" "The guests are seated, and I've got something for the bride." She handed Julia an envelope. Inside was the final conviction notice. Victoria and James had both received substantial sentences. It was over, really over. "I thought you'd want to know," the detective said softly. "You can move forward now, completely free." "We already were," Julia replied, touching the butterfly pendant Alexander had given her. "The moment we chose love over fear." The wedding march began to play softly from the garden. Richard offered his arm to Julia, while Detective Morris helped Sophie line up with her basket of purple flower petals. "Ready?" Richard asked. Julia took a deep breath, looking out the window at the gathered guests, at the butterfly house Sophie had helped design, at the man waiting for her beneath the flower arch, standing just as he'd promised. "Ready," she said firmly. Sophie went first, scattering petals and beaming at Alexander, who winked at her. Then came Julia on Richard's arm, her heart racing as she saw Alexander's face, saw the love there that had transformed all their lives. When they reached the altar, Alexander took her hands in his. He was trembling slightly from the effort of standing, but his voice was strong and clear. "I thought my life was over," he began his vows, "until you and Sophie showed me it was just beginning. You didn't try to fix me. You helped me fix myself. You saw strength where I saw weakness, hope where I saw despair, and love where I thought none could grow again." Julia squeezed his hands, her own vows flowing from her heart. "You became our home when we were lost, our strength when we were afraid, and our joy when we dared to dream again. You showed Sophie what a father's love truly means, and you showed me that sometimes the most beautiful things come from the hardest struggles." Sophie stepped forward then, her role in the ceremony carefully planned. "And I promise to always help find lost butterflies, to make you laugh when you're sad, and to love you both forever and ever." There wasn't a dry eye in the garden as Alexander and Julia exchanged rings. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Sophie released the butterflies. They rose into the autumn sky, their wings catching the sunlight, dancing on the breeze like hopes and dreams set free. At the reception, Alexander surprised everyone by leading Julia in a slow dance, his movements careful but confident. Sophie danced around them, scattering more flower petals and giggling. Richard raised his glass for a toast. To new beginnings, to the power of love to heal all wounds, and to the kind of family that chooses each other every day. To butterflies, Sophie added, making everyone laugh. Later, as the sun set over Thornfield Estate, Alexander held Julia close while Sophie slept in a chair nearby, flower petals still clinging to her dress. "Happy?" he asked softly. "Complete," Julia corrected, kissing him gently. Above them, the last of the butterflies circled before flying free, their wings strong enough now for any journey, just like the love that had given 3 lost souls the power to fly again. 1 year after the wedding, Thornfield Estate had become unrecognizable. The once austere mansion now buzzed with life and purpose. The East Wing had been transformed into the headquarters of the Thornfield Foundation for Rehabilitation, while the extensive grounds hosted a state-of-the-art aquatic therapy center. Alexander stood at the window of his office, watching a group of patients working with therapists in the butterfly garden. His own walking had improved significantly, though he still kept the wheelchair nearby for longer days. "Mr. Thornfield?" His assistant poked her head in. "Your wife is here with the new program proposals, and Sophie insists it's urgent." He smiled, hearing the barely contained excitement in Sophie's voice from the hallway. "Send my girls in." Sophie burst through the door first, her school uniform slightly rumpled, and her backpack covered in even more butterfly stickers than before. At 9 years old, she had appointed herself the Foundation's unofficial cheerleader. "Daddy, Miss Garcia's whole class wants to help with the butterfly release program, can we?" "Please." Julia followed more sedately, though her eyes sparkled with the same enthusiasm. "She's already drafted a proposal, very professional." Alexander accepted the slightly crumpled papers from Sophie, pretending to study them with great seriousness. Butterfly education programs, community involvement, environmental impact studies." He looked up at his daughter proudly. "Did you do this all by yourself?" "Well," Sophie admitted, "Mommy helped with the big words and Grandpa Richard showed me how to make the budget thing, but the ideas are all mine." "They're excellent ideas," Alexander assured her, pulling her into a hug. "Why don't you go show them to Ms. Chen in program development? She's been looking for ways to expand our community outreach." After Sophie bounced out, Julia moved to perch on Alexander's desk. "She's really blooming here, isn't she?" "We all are," he replied, taking her hand. His fingers found the butterfly ring he'd given her, now accompanied by a wedding band. "How was the morning session?" "Amazing!" Julia's face lit up. "The new aquatic therapy protocols are showing incredible results. That young athlete I told you about, she took her first steps without support today." Alexander pulled her closer, his heart full. "Remember when you first came here? When I thought nothing would ever get better? You've come so far." Julia touched his cheek gently. "We all have." A knock at the door interrupted them. Richard entered, looking pleased. "The board just approved the expansion plans. We can break ground on the new pediatric wing next month." "Sophie will be thrilled," Alexander smiled. "She's already planning the children's butterfly garden." "That granddaughter of mine," Richard chuckled. "She's got more business sense than half my executives." Speaking of which, he pulled out his phone, showing them a news alert. Victoria's appeal was denied. Alexander felt Julia's hand tighten in his, but the name no longer held any power over them. "Good," he said simply. "How's the new security system coming along?" "State of the art," Richard assured them, "though I doubt we'll need it. The Foundation's reputation is growing. Even Victoria wouldn't dare threaten what we've built here." They were interrupted by excited voices from the hallway. Sophie returned with Ms. Chen, both of them talking animatedly about butterfly release schedules and educational programs. "Ms. Chen says we can start next month," Sophie announced. "Can I tell my class tomorrow?" "Wait until we finalize the details, Butterfly," Julia laughed. "Why don't you show Grandpa your proposal while Daddy and I check on the afternoon therapy session?" As they walked through the gardens toward the therapy center, Alexander and Julia passed dozens of patients working with therapists, each focused on their own journey of recovery. The butterfly house Sophie had helped design buzzed with activity, its inhabitants providing both beauty and hope to those working to regain their strength. Sometimes I can't believe how much has changed, Alexander mused, his step steady beside Julia. Not just physically, but everything. Change isn't always easy, Julia replied, thinking of their journey. But sometimes it's exactly what we need to become who we're meant to be. They reached the therapy pool, where their next patient was waiting, a young girl recently injured in an accident, her eyes filled with the same fear and anger Alexander had once known so well. "Ready to begin?" Julia asked her gently. The girl looked uncertain until she spotted something through the window. Sophie, releasing a newly emerged butterfly from the butterfly house, her face alight with joy as it took flight. "Yes," the girl said firmly. "I'm ready." Alexander squeezed Julia's hand, both of them recognizing the moment for what it was. Another life about to transform, another soul about to learn that broken wings could heal, could even become stronger in the broken places. Above them, butterflies danced in the afternoon sun, their wings catching the light like promises kept, like love made visible, like hope taking flight again and again. Spring returned to Thornfield Estate, bringing with it a special anniversary. 1 year since the foundation's opening, 5 years since Julia and Sophie first walked through the gates. The gardens were in full bloom, butterflies floating among the flowers like living jewels. The morning dawned bright and clear as final preparations were made for the Foundation's first annual rehabilitation symposium. Medical professionals from around the world had gathered to learn about the innovative programs developed at Thornfield, particularly the combination of aquatic therapy and psychological support that had shown such remarkable results. Alexander stood at the podium in the newly constructed conference center, his stance confident and strong. Julia sat in the front row with Sophie, both of them beaming with pride. 5 years ago, he began, I thought my life was over. An accident had left me not just physically injured, but spiritually broken. I had lost hope, lost my way, lost myself. He paused, meeting Julia's eyes. Then 2 angels walked into my life, though one of them was disguised as a very determined physical therapist. Laughter rippled through the audience. Sophie sat up straighter, knowing she was the other angel in the story. What they taught me, what we've built here at the Thornfield Foundation, is about more than physical rehabilitation. It's about healing the whole person. It's about understanding that sometimes our greatest struggles can lead to our most profound transformations. As if on cue, Sophie slipped away from Julia and approached the stage, carrying a small terrarium. Inside was a chrysalis, carefully transported from the butterfly house. My daughter, Alexander's voice filled with pride at the word, reminds us daily that transformation is a natural part of life, that what looks like an ending can actually be a beginning. The chrysalis began to move as Sophie held it up for the audience to see. Gasps of wonder filled the room as a monarch butterfly emerged, its wings slowly unfurling in the morning light. Each person who comes through our doors is on their own journey of transformation, Alexander continued. Our job isn't to force that change, but to provide the support, the tools, and most importantly, the belief that change is possible. Julia joined them on stage as Sophie carefully opened the terrarium. The butterfly paused for a moment on her small hand before taking flight, circling the auditorium once before finding its way to freedom through an open window. The audience burst into applause, but Alexander wasn't finished. Today, we're announcing the expansion of our programs. Thanks to the generous support of our donors and the incredible work of our staff, we'll be opening 5 new rehabilitation centers across the country. Each one will feature our integrated approach, including, he gestured to Julia, who stepped forward to explain the technical aspects of their programs. Sophie remained on stage, her presence a testament to the family-centered approach that made Thornfield unique. Later, as they walked through the butterfly garden where it all began, Alexander pulled Julia close. "Happy anniversary," he whispered. "Which one?" she teased. "Meeting, wedding, foundation?" "All of them," he replied. "Every moment since you and Sophie came into my life is worth celebrating." Sophie, who had been examining a new chrysalis, called out excitedly, "Look, this one's almost ready too." They joined her at the butterfly house, where dozens of chrysalises hung like promises waiting to be kept. Each one represented a potential transformation, a new beginning. "You know what Miss Garcia says about butterflies now?" Sophie asked, her face serious. "What's that, butterfly?" Alexander encouraged. "She says they're like love. You have to be patient, be gentle, and believe in the magic of change." Julia felt tears prick her eyes as Alexander wrapped an arm around each of them. "Miss Garcia is very wise," she managed. Richard found them there a few minutes later, standing together in the garden where their story had unfolded, where fear had given way to hope, anger to love, and broken pieces had been transformed into something more beautiful than anyone could have imagined. "The next group is ready for the tour," he announced softly, reluctant to interrupt the moment. "Come on," Alexander said, taking Julia's hand. "Let's show them what's possible when you believe in transformation." As they walked toward the therapy center, Sophie trailing behind them, examining every butterfly that passed, they were exactly what they had become. A family built on hope, strengthened by love and dedicated to helping others find their wings. The butterfly that had emerged during Alexander's speech floated above them, its wings catching the sunlight like a blessing, a reminder that sometimes the most beautiful stories begin with broken wings and end with the courage to fly again. 10 years had passed since Julia and Sophie first walked through the gates of Thornfield Estate. The property, once a symbol of isolation and pain, had become a beacon of hope for thousands. The Thornfield Foundation now operated rehabilitation centers across the country, each one incorporating the butterfly gardens that had become their signature. On this particular morning, Alexander stood in his old therapy room, now part of a museum showcasing the Foundation's journey. Display cases held photographs and artifacts, the first wheelchair he'd used, Sophie's original butterfly drawings, the proposal for their initial rehabilitation program. "Getting nostalgic," Julia's voice came from behind him. She wrapped her arms around his waist and he leaned into her embrace. "Just thinking about how far we've come," he replied, touching a photo of their wedding day. "Remember how nervous I was about walking down the aisle? And now look at you," she smiled. "Running board meetings, giving speeches, chasing our butterfly around the gardens." Their peaceful moment was interrupted by the sound of running feet. Sophie, now 15, burst into the room, her school uniform slightly askew and her face glowing with excitement. "Dad! Mom! You'll never believe what happened at school today." She paused, catching her breath. "Remember that essay I wrote about the foundation? Miss Garcia submitted it to the National Youth Leadership Conference, and I've been chosen to present it." Alexander pulled his daughter into a tight hug. "That's amazing, Butterfly. When is the presentation?" "Next month in Washington," Sophie beamed. "And guess what else? They want to feature the Foundation's youth outreach program as a model for other organizations." Julia watched her daughter and husband together, her heart full. Sophie had grown into a passionate advocate for rehabilitation and mental health support, using her own experience to help other families dealing with trauma and recovery. Richard appeared in the doorway, looking distinguished as ever, despite his advancing years. "Did I hear something about Washington?" "Grandpa?" Sophie launched into an excited explanation of her presentation plans, complete with butterfly metaphors that had become the family's trademark. "Speaking of butterflies," Richard said when she paused for breath, "the new pediatric wing needs a tour guide for today's group. Interested?" Sophie's face lit up. She had been giving tours since she was 12, sharing her unique perspective on the healing process with patients and their families. "Can I show them the original butterfly garden first?" she asked. "I want them to see where it all started." As Sophie and Richard headed out, Julia noticed Alexander watching them with misty eyes. "What is it?" she asked softly. "Just thinking about that first day," he replied. "When you and Sophie walked in and turned my whole world upside down. I was so angry, so lost. And now," he turned to her, his eyes full of love. "Now I understand that sometimes the things that seem to break us actually set us free." Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion from the garden. Sophie's voice carried through the open window, full of enthusiasm, as she spoke to a group of young patients and their families. "See this butterfly house? This is where I learned that broken things can become beautiful. My dad taught me that strength isn't about never falling. It's about having the courage to try again. And sometimes, the most amazing transformations happen when we least expect them." Alexander and Julia moved to the window, watching as their daughter released a newly emerged butterfly, her audience gasping in wonder as it took flight. "She's going to change the world," Julia said proudly. "She already has," Alexander replied, pulling his wife close, just like her mother. In the garden below, Sophie continued her tour, her voice carrying the hope and wisdom that had become the foundation's hallmark. The butterfly she'd released circled once above the group, before soaring higher, its wings catching the sunlight like a promise kept, like love made visible, like the legacy of healing that had begun with a broken man, a determined therapist, and a little girl who believed in the magic of transformation. The morning sun painted everything in shades of gold, touching the flowers, the buildings, and the people who had found their way to Thornfield Estate. Each one carried their own story of struggle and hope, of breaking and healing, of learning to fly again. And above it all, butterflies danced in the breeze, their wings spread wide and strong, reminding everyone who saw them that sometimes the most beautiful transformations begin with the courage to spread broken wings and try again. The sunset painted the sky in shades of purple, Sophie's favorite color, as the Thornfield Estate prepared for a special evening celebration. 10 years since the foundation's inception, 15 since the day that had changed everything. The grand ballroom, once a testament to cold luxury, had been transformed into a butterfly sanctuary for the night. Living butterflies floated among carefully crafted paper ones, each carrying messages of hope from patients whose lives had been touched by the foundation. Alexander stood at the center of it all, his stance strong and confident, watching as guests arrived. Medical professionals, patients, families, each one part of the greater story they had built together. "Nervous about your speech?" Julia appeared beside him, elegant in a dress embroidered with subtle butterfly patterns. "Not anymore," he smiled, taking her hand. "I finally know exactly what to say." Sophie rushed up to them, no longer the small child who had first asked about his wheelchair, but a poised young woman who had inherited her mother's compassion and her father's determination. "Everything's ready," she announced. "The new virtual reality rehabilitation program is set up for the demonstration, and the documentary team is in place." Julia squeezed her daughter's hand. "Your Miss Garcia would be so proud of you." "She is," Sophie grinned. "She's right over there, telling everyone how she knew I'd follow in your footsteps." Indeed, the now retired teacher was holding court near the butterfly house, explaining to anyone who would listen how her former student had helped revolutionize rehabilitation therapy through the Foundation's youth programs. Richard joined them, leaning slightly on a cane, but his eyes as sharp as ever. "They're ready for you, Alexander." The room fell quiet as Alexander took the stage, Julia and Sophie flanking him, a united front as always. 15 years ago, he began, I thought I knew everything about loss, about pain, about what it meant to be broken. He paused, looking at his family. I was wrong. What I didn't know then was that sometimes being broken is just the first step toward becoming something more beautiful, more resilient, more true. He gestured to the butterflies floating above them. These creatures have become our symbol, not just because of their beauty, but because of their truth. They remind us that transformation isn't easy. It requires struggle, patience, and most importantly, love. Julia felt tears in her eyes as Alexander continued. The Thornfield Foundation began as a way to help others heal. What we didn't expect was how it would heal us. Every person who has walked through our doors has taught us something about courage, about resilience, about the endless capacity of the human spirit to transform and soar. Sophie stepped forward then, her voice clear and strong. 10 years ago, we had one butterfly garden and a dream. Today we have rehabilitation centers across the country, each one carrying the message that helped save my father. Broken wings can heal, and sometimes they become stronger in the broken places. The audience burst into applause as a screen lowered, showing images from their journey. The first butterfly garden, the opening of the foundation, patients taking their first steps, families reuniting, hopes being rebuilt. But tonight, Alexander continued when the applause faded, isn't just about celebrating our past. Tonight we look to the future. Julia joined him at the podium. We're excited to announce the establishment of the Thornfield Scholarship Program, providing education, and training for the next generation of rehabilitation specialists. And, Sophie added, her eyes sparkling, the launch of our international outreach program, bringing our integrated approach to rehabilitation centers around the world. As they concluded their presentation, the paper, butterflies above began to glow softly, their messages of hope illuminated like stars. Each one represented a life touched, a transformation witnessed, a flight restored. Later, as the celebration continued around them, Alexander held Julia close as they danced. Sophie was nearby, explaining the Foundation's programs to a group of medical students, her passion evident in every gesture. "Did you ever imagine this?" Alexander asked softly. "That first day when you walked through those gates?" Julia looked up at him, her eyes full of love. "I imagined helping you heal. I never imagined you'd help heal so many others." "We did it together," he reminded her. "All of us." From somewhere in the garden came the sound of children's laughter, young patients and their siblings exploring the butterfly house that had started it all. Above them, real and paper butterflies danced together in the gentle evening breeze, their wings catching the light like promises kept, like love made visible, like hope taking flight again and again. And in that moment, surrounded by the legacy they had built together, they were exactly what they had become, a family that had learned to fly not despite their broken places, but because of them. A testament to the truth that love, like butterflies, knows no bounds, and that sometimes the most beautiful stories begin with broken wings and end with endless flight. The morning sun streamed through the windows of Sophie's dorm room at Stanford University, where she was preparing for her first day of medical school. At 18, she had graduated high school early and completed her undergraduate studies in record time, driven by her passion for rehabilitation medicine. "Are you sure you have everything you need?" Julia asked through the video call, her face filled with motherly concern on Sophie's laptop screen. "Mom, I'm fine," Sophie laughed, adjusting her signature butterfly pendant, a graduation gift from Alexander. "Dad already had the entire apartment furnished, and Grandpa Richard practically bought out the medical bookstore. We just want to make sure you're comfortable." Alexander's voice came through as he joined Julia on screen. "It's a big step, Butterfly." Sophie's expression softened at the childhood nickname. "I learned from the best, remember? Besides, I'm not that far from the new Thornfield Center in San Francisco. I can help with the pediatric program on weekends." "Just don't overwork yourself," Julia cautioned. "Medical school is demanding enough without—" A knock at Sophie's door interrupted them. "That must be my study group," she said. "We're reviewing anatomy before classes start tomorrow." "Call us later," Alexander asked, trying not to let his voice betray how much he missed her. "Promise," Sophie smiled. "Love you both." After ending the call, Sophie opened her door to find her study group and stopped short. Among the familiar faces from orientation was a young man in a wheelchair, his smile warm and slightly nervous. "Hi," he said. "I'm Michael. Hope you don't mind. They said you were the one to talk to about adaptive medical education techniques." Sophie's heart skipped a beat as she recognized him from the rehabilitation center where she'd volunteered last summer. "Of course. Come in, everyone. I actually have some insights from the Thornfield Foundation that might help." Back at Thornfield Estate, Julia found Alexander in their butterfly garden, his expression thoughtful. "She's going to be amazing," Julia said, sitting beside him. "She already is," he replied. I keep thinking about that little girl who asked me why I never smiled. Now she's going to be a doctor, helping other people find their way back to smiling." Speaking of helping others, Julia pulled out her tablet. "The results from the new virtual reality therapy program are incredible. Patients are showing 40% faster recovery rates when we combine it with the butterfly garden therapy sessions." Alexander took the tablet, but his attention was caught by something else, a familiar face approaching through the garden. "Mrs. Reynolds," he called out, surprised to see their former housekeeper. She had retired 5 years ago to spend time with her grandchildren. The elderly woman smiled, but there was worry in her eyes. "I'm sorry to drop by unannounced, but my granddaughter, Emily, she was in an accident last month. The doctors say she'll never dance again. But I remembered how they said you'd never walk again. And yet—" Julia and Alexander exchanged a look, years of shared purpose passing between them in an instant. "Tell us about Emily," Julia said warmly, gesturing for Mrs. Reynolds to sit. "And let us tell you about butterflies and hope and the way healing really works." As they talked, a monarch butterfly landed on the bench between them, its wings slowly opening and closing like possibility itself taking shape. Above them, the sign for the Thornfield Foundation caught the morning light, where broken wings learn to soar again. In her dorm room across the country, Sophie was already deep in discussion with her study group, her hands moving animatedly as she explained the principles she'd learned from her parents. Michael watched her with growing admiration, recognizing in her the same spirit of determination and hope that had helped him after his own accident. "It's not about getting back to who you were," Sophie was saying, echoing words she'd heard her father speak countless times. "It's about discovering who you can become." The future was unfolding before them all, full of new challenges and possibilities, but grounded in the truths they had learned together, that love heals, that hope transforms, and that sometimes the most beautiful flights begin with broken wings. Emily Reynolds sat in her wheelchair in the Thornfield Foundation's newest therapy room, staring at the butterfly mural on the wall. At 16, she had been a promising ballet dancer. Now, 3 months after her accident, she felt as lost as Alexander had once been. "The first day is always the hardest," a gentle voice said from the doorway. Julia stood there, her years of experience evident in the calm confidence she projected. "Mrs. Thornfield," Emily started to say, but Julia interrupted with a warm smile. "Julia, please, and I believe you already know my husband." Alexander entered the room, his movements strong and sure despite the slight limp that remained from his old injury. "Your grandmother tells me you're a dancer." "Was," Emily corrected bitterly. "Was a dancer." Alexander wheeled a chair over and sat down at her eye level. "You know, I used to say I was a swimmer, past tense. Then someone very special taught me that we don't stop being who we are just because the way we do things changes." Emily's eyes flickered to his legs, then back to his face. "But you can walk now." "Now, yes," he agreed. "But the real healing didn't start with my legs, it started here." He touched his heart. "When I learned that sometimes our greatest setbacks lead us to our true path." Julia moved to the therapy pool's edge, activating the virtual reality system they'd recently installed. The room transformed around them, filling with projected butterflies that seemed to dance through the air. "Emily," Julia said softly, "would you like to tell us about your favorite dance?" Meanwhile, across the country, Sophie was discovering her own way of carrying forward her family's legacy. During a break between classes, she found Michael struggling with a medical simulator designed for standing students. "Here," she said, pulling over a chair. "Dad helped design an adaptive version of this. Let me show you." As she demonstrated the modified technique, their hands brushed, sending a flutter through her stomach that reminded her of butterfly wings. "How do you know so much about this?" Michael asked, mastering the new approach quickly. Sophie told him about growing up at Thornfield, about watching her father learn to walk again, about the thousands of patients who had become part of their extended family. "That's why I want to specialize in rehabilitation medicine," she concluded. "Every person who comes through those doors reminds me of that first day with my dad, when everyone else saw limitations, but Mom saw possibility." Back at Thornfield, Emily was floating in the therapy pool, tears mixing with water as she moved through a modified dance sequence Julia had designed for her. "I'm still graceful," she whispered, sounding surprised. "For you always will be," Alexander assured her. "Grace isn't about perfection, it's about the spirit behind the movement." Mrs. Reynolds watched from the observation window, her own eyes wet as she saw her granddaughter smile for the first time since the accident. Richard joined her, leaning on his cane. "Remarkable, isn't it? How history repeats itself in the most beautiful ways. I remember when Alexander was where she is now," Mrs. Reynolds nodded, "when Julia and Sophie first came. And now look," Richard gestured to the scene before them. "Every broken wing that learns to fly again adds to their story." In the pool, Emily was discovering new ways to move, her dancer's spirit awakening to different rhythms. The projected butterflies swirled around her, their light reflecting off the water like scattered hope. Julia's phone buzzed with a text from Sophie. "Just finished my first major anatomy exam. Also, there's someone I'd like you and Dad to meet at Thanksgiving." Julia showed the message to Alexander, both of them recognizing the tone in their daughter's words. Their butterfly was finding new ways to spread her own wings. As the day drew to a close, Emily asked the question they'd been waiting for. "When can I come back?" Alexander smiled, remembering asking Julia the same question all those years ago. "Tomorrow," he said, "and the next day, and the next. Until you're ready to fly on your own." The evening sun painted the therapy room in shades of gold, catching the water drops that fell from Emily's fingers as she traced patterns in the air. A dancer still, though dancing differently now. Above her, real and projected butterflies mingled, their wings carrying the promise that had become the heart of Thornfield, that every ending holds the seeds of a new beginning, and every broken wing carries the potential for a different kind of flight. Thanksgiving approached at Thornfield Estate, bringing with it the crisp air of change. The butterfly gardens, though touched by autumn, remained vibrant thanks to the climate-controlled environments they'd developed for year-round therapeutic programs. Julia stood in the kitchen, supervising the preparation of Sophie's favorite dishes. Her daughter was bringing someone special home for the first time, and everything had to be perfect. "She's nervous," Alexander commented, entering with a stack of medical journals Sophie had requested. "Our butterfly nervous? Can you believe it?" "I can," Julia smiled. "Remember how I felt the first time I had dinner here? When Victoria—" She trailed off, but Alexander caught her hand, squeezing it gently. "This is different. This time it's family." The sound of wheels on gravel announced the first arrival, Emily accompanied by Mrs. Reynolds. In the 3 months since starting therapy, the young dancer had begun teaching movement classes for other patients from her wheelchair, discovering a gift for helping others find their rhythm again. "Miss Julia, Mr. Alexander," Emily called out, her face glowing with excitement. "Wait until you see what my students prepared for the Foundation's Christmas program." Before she could elaborate, another car pulled up. Sophie stepped out, her medical school confidence momentarily replaced by nervous energy. Behind her, Michael navigated his wheelchair with practiced ease, carrying a bouquet of purple flowers. "Mom, Dad," Sophie began, her voice slightly shaky. "This is Michael. Michael, these are my parents, and that's Emily, one of our STAR therapy program graduates." Alexander moved forward first, extending his hand to Michael. "Sophie's told us a lot about your work with adaptive medical education. We're very interested in incorporating some of your ideas into our training programs." Michael relaxed slightly, clearly more comfortable discussing professional matters. "Your foundation's research actually inspired my thesis on improving accessibility in medical training. I never imagined I'd get to discuss it with you in person." "Well," Julia smiled warmly, "we have all weekend for that. Sophie, why don't you show Michael the butterfly garden? The new night-blooming species just arrived." As the young couple moved toward the garden, Emily watched them with a knowing smile. "They look at each other the same way you and Mr. Alexander do," she observed to Julia. Inside the garden, Sophie was showing Michael the illuminated pathways they'd designed for evening therapy sessions. The butterflies, drawn to the gentle lighting, created dancing shadows around them. "So," Michael said softly, "this is where it all began, where your dad learned to walk again." Sophie nodded, touching a flower gently. "This garden taught me that healing comes in many forms. Sometimes it's learning to walk again, sometimes it's finding new ways to dance, and sometimes it's meeting someone who sees you for who you are, not what you can or can't do," Michael finished, taking her hand. From the house, Alexander and Julia watched their daughter's first romance unfold with misty eyes. Richard joined them, moving more slowly these days, but his mind still sharp. "Reminds me of another couple who found love in that garden," he commented. Emily wheeled up beside them. "Mrs. Julia, I've been thinking about what you said, about paying it forward. I want to start a dance therapy program for kids with spinal injuries. Would the foundation—" "Of course we'll support it," Alexander answered immediately. "That's what Thornfield is all about, turning our challenges into opportunities to help others." Later that evening, as they gathered for dinner, the conversation flowed naturally between medical research, foundation projects, and personal stories. Michael shared his experiences developing adaptive techniques for medical students, while Emily described her vision for inclusive dance education. "You know," Sophie said during a lull in conversation, "I used to think the butterfly metaphor was just about transformation. But being in medical school, seeing how everything connects, it's also about the ripple effect. How one small change can create waves of impact. Julia caught Alexander's eye across the table, both of them remembering that first dinner years ago when tension and fear had filled this same room. Now it overflowed with love, purpose, and possibility. As if underlining the moment, one of the new night butterflies floated in through an open window, its luminescent wings catching the chandelier's light. It landed on the centerpiece, slowly opening and closing its wings like a heartbeat, like hope, like love made visible. To new beginnings. Richard raised his glass, looking around at the family that had grown in such unexpected and beautiful ways. And to the wings that carry us there, Emily added, her dancer's grace evident even in the simple act of raising her glass. The night deepened around Thornfield Estate, wrapping the expanded family in its gentle embrace. In the garden, the night-blooming flowers released their fragrance, attracting moths and luminescent butterflies in an ethereal dance of light and shadow, of endings and beginnings, of love that continues to transform and grow in the most surprising and beautiful ways. The winter gala at Thornfield Foundation had always been special, but this year promised something extraordinary. Emily's dance therapy program was making its debut, combining with Sophie and Michael's research on movement-based rehabilitation techniques. The grand ballroom had been transformed into a magical space where light and shadow played like dancing partners. Projected butterflies, now enhanced with Michael's biomedical engineering expertise, responded to the movements of the dancers below. "Are you ready?" Julia asked Emily, who was making final adjustments to her costume. The young dancer had choreographed a piece that would showcase both wheelchair-bound and standing dancers, breaking traditional boundaries of what dance could be. "I think so," Emily smiled, though her hands trembled slightly. "I just want to make them understand that different doesn't mean less beautiful." "They'll understand," Alexander assured her, entering with Sophie and Michael. "Just like you helped me understand that healing isn't always about getting back what we lost. Sometimes it's about discovering something new." Sophie knelt beside Emily's wheelchair, adjusting a butterfly clip in her hair. "The neural response monitors are ready. When you dance, the butterflies will follow your emotional patterns, creating a visual representation of the healing process." "My best friend, the brilliant doctor-to-be," Emily laughed, some of her nervousness fading. Who would have thought that falling in love with a biomedical engineer would lead to dancing butterflies? Sophie blushed as Michael squeezed her hand. Their relationship had blossomed over the months, their shared passion for adaptive medicine creating a bond that went beyond romance to true partnership. The audience was gathering, medical professionals, patients, families, and supporters of the foundation. Richard sat in the front row, his pride evident as he watched the next generation carrying forward the legacy of hope and healing. Mrs. Reynolds appeared at the door. "It's time." The lights dimmed and Emily wheeled to center stage. The music began softly, a piece she had composed herself, incorporating the rhythms of butterfly wings in flight. As she began to move, the projected butterflies responded, their wings catching her emotions and translating them into patterns of light. Other dancers joined her, some in wheelchairs, some standing, all moving in harmony. The choreography told the story of transformation, not as a single moment, but as a continuous journey of discovery and growth. In the audience, Alexander held Julia's hand tightly, both of them remembering their own dance at their wedding, the first time he had stood long enough to complete a full song. Now they watched as Emily and her dancers showed that grace knew no boundaries, that beauty could find expression in countless ways. Sophie and Michael operated the neural monitoring system from backstage, but their attention was as much on each other as on the equipment. "We did it," Sophie whispered, as the butterfly projections responded perfectly to the dancers' movements. "You did it," Michael corrected softly. "I just helped with the technical details. This vision, all of this, it's pure Sophie Thornfield." The performance reached its climax as Emily's wheelchair spun in a series of intricate movements, the other dancers weaving around her like wings taking flight. Above them, the projected butterflies created a kaleidoscope of color and light, responding to the joy and triumph emanating from the dancers below. As the final notes faded, there was a moment of absolute silence before the audience erupted in thunderous applause. Emily's face shone with tears of joy as she took in the standing ovation, her fellow dancers gathering around her in celebration. Later at the reception, Richard raised his glass for a toast. To Emily, who showed us yet another way that broken wings can create beautiful patterns. To Sophie and Michael, whose brilliant minds are helping us understand the science of healing. And to all of you who continue to believe in the power of transformation. Alexander added his own words, his voice thick with emotion. When I first met Julia and Sophie, I thought my story was over. What I didn't understand was that it was just beginning, and that it would become part of a larger story, one that continues to unfold in ways we never could have imagined. Emily wheeled over to join them, still glowing from the performance. Miss Julia always says that healing is like a dance. It has its own rhythm, its own time, its own grace. And sometimes, Sophie added, leaning into Michael's embrace, the most beautiful dances are the ones we never expected to learn. The night deepened around Thornfield Estate, but the ballroom remained alive with light and movement. Real butterflies from the garden had found their way inside, mingling with their projected counterparts in a dance of reality and dreams, of science and magic, of love that continues to find new ways to take flight. Above it all, the full moon painted silver patterns through the skylights, touching everyone with its gentle light. The dancers who had discovered new ways to move, the doctors who had learned to heal with both science and compassion, and the family that had grown from broken wings into something more beautiful than anyone could have imagined. Spring brought more than butterflies to Thornfield Estate that year. The gardens bloomed with new life as preparations were made for two significant events: the launch of Emily's international dance therapy program and, to everyone's joy, Sophie and Michael's engagement. The proposal had happened in the butterfly garden naturally. Michael had arranged for the night-blooming flowers to be in full blossom, their luminescent butterflies creating a magical atmosphere as he asked the question that had been growing in his heart since that first study session in medical school. "Did you know?" Julia asked Alexander as they watched Sophie showing her ring to Emily, a delicate butterfly design that Michael had custom-made, incorporating elements from the original Thornfield butterfly house. "I helped him design the ring," Alexander admitted, his eyes misty. He wanted it to represent not just their love, but everything the foundation stands for: transformation, hope, healing. Richard joined them, moving slowly, but his eyes bright with joy. "Have you seen the designs they're working on? They're combining Michael's adaptive medical technology with Sophie's rehabilitation protocols. The Foundation's next chapter is going to be remarkable." In the garden, Sophie and Emily were deep in discussion about the upcoming international program launch. Emily's dance therapy methods had caught the attention of rehabilitation centers worldwide, and the Foundation was sponsoring a global initiative. "We'll start in London," Emily explained, her hands moving animatedly as she spoke. "Then Paris, Tokyo, Sydney, bringing the butterfly effect to rehabilitation centers around the world. And Michael's neural response technology will help track patient progress," Sophie added, her medical training and her fiancé's expertise combining perfectly. "We can quantify the emotional and physical benefits of movement therapy." Michael wheeled up to them, carrying blueprints for the new adaptive medical training center they were building. "The construction team just confirmed. We're on schedule for the summer opening." The center would be their wedding gift from Alexander and Julia, a state-of-the-art facility dedicated to training medical professionals in adaptive techniques and inclusive patient care. "I still can't believe how everything has come together," Sophie said, looking around at the garden where her childhood dreams had taken root and grown into something far beyond what anyone could have imagined. Mrs. Reynolds appeared with refreshments, her granddaughter's success having given her a new spring in her step. "Just wait until you see what the kitchen's planning for the engagement party," she beamed. "We're even making butterfly-shaped pastries." As the afternoon progressed, more family members arrived, patients who had become friends, staff who had become family, all drawn together by the web of healing and hope that had spread from Thornfield Estate. Julia found herself in the original butterfly house, where it had all begun. The chrysalis that had transformed their lives might be long gone, but its legacy lived on in every life they touched, every wing they helped mend. Alexander found her there, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "Remembering, dreaming," she corrected softly. looking at how far we've come and wondering what other miracles are waiting to unfold. Through the glass, they could see Sophie and Michael working with a group of medical students, demonstrating new techniques for adaptive patient care. Emily was in the therapy pool, leading a water ballet class for children with mobility challenges. Richard sat with Mrs. Reynolds, both of them beaming as they watched the next generation carry forward their legacy of hope. A new butterfly emerged from its chrysalis above them, its wings still wet and crumpled. They watched in comfortable silence as it slowly spread its wings, gathering strength for its first flight. "You know what Sophie said to me yesterday?" Alexander spoke softly. "She said that falling in love with Michael helped her understand what happened between us all those years ago. How love doesn't just heal, it transforms. It makes us more than we were, different than we planned, better than we imagined." Julia turned in his arms, touching his face gently. "Our butterfly has grown wise. She learned from the best," he smiled, kissing her softly. Outside, the spring breeze carried the sound of laughter and hope, of plans being made and dreams taking flight. The Thornfield Foundation had become more than a rehabilitation center. It was a beacon of possibility, a place where broken wings learned not just to heal, but to soar in new and beautiful ways. As the sun began to set, casting golden light through the butterfly house, Sophie called everyone together. She and Michael had an announcement to make. They had decided to hold their wedding in the garden where so many transformations had begun. "Because some things," Sophie explained, her eyes shining, "come full circle in the most beautiful ways." And above them all, butterflies danced in the evening light, their wings catching the sun like promises, like dreams, like love that continues to find new ways to take flight. The summer air hummed with anticipation as final preparations were made for Sophie and Michael's wedding. The butterfly garden had been transformed into a wonderland where science and nature merged seamlessly. Michael's neural responsive lighting systems created patterns that followed the flight of real butterflies, while Emily's dance therapy students prepared a special performance. Julia found Sophie in her old room, now a peaceful retreat filled with medical journals and butterfly specimens. Her daughter stood before the mirror, her wedding dress a modern interpretation of transformation, the skirt designed to flow like wings in motion. "I found something," Julia said softly, holding out a small, worn notebook. "Your first butterfly drawings from when we first came here." Sophie took the notebook with trembling hands. "I was so young," she whispered, turning the pages. "But somehow I knew, didn't I, that butterflies would change everything?" "You saw hope when the rest of us were still learning to look for it," Julia agreed, helping Sophie with her veil, designed with subtle patterns that mimicked butterfly wing scales. Meanwhile, in another part of the estate, Alexander was helping Michael with his bow tie. The young doctor's hands were shaking too much to manage it himself. "I was just as nervous on my wedding day," Alexander assured him, "terrified I wouldn't be able to stand long enough for the ceremony." "How did you manage?" Michael asked, his own wheelchair positioned near the window overlooking the garden preparations. "I remembered what Sophie once told me, that broken things can become beautiful in new ways." Alexander smiled at the memory. "She was wise beyond her years, even then." "She still is," Michael agreed softly. "Did you know she's incorporating butterfly imagery into her new physical therapy protocols? The way they emerge from chrysalises, she says it's the perfect metaphor for neural rewiring and rehabilitation." In the garden, Emily directed her dance students through one final rehearsal of their wedding performance. The choreography told the story of transformation, wheelchairs and traditional dancers moving together in perfect harmony, their movements tracked by Michael's systems to create synchronized light patterns above. Richard watched from his favorite bench, remembering another wedding in this same garden years ago. Mrs. Reynolds joined him, carrying 2 cups of tea. "Did you ever imagine," she asked, "when you hired Julia all those years ago that we'd end up here?" "Not in my wildest dreams," Richard admitted, "but that's the beauty of transformation, isn't it? It takes us places we never thought possible." The wedding itself was a celebration of everything the Thornfield Foundation had come to represent. Medical professionals from around the world sat alongside patients and their families. Emily's dancers created living art as Sophie made her way down the aisle, her dress catching the light like butterfly wings. Michael waited beneath an arch of flowers and lights, his wheelchair decorated with subtle butterfly motifs. When Sophie reached him, their hands met in a gesture that spoke of both love and understanding, two healers who had found in each other the perfect balance of strength and vulnerability. Alexander performed the ceremony, his voice strong with emotion as he spoke about love's power to transform, to heal, to create new possibilities from life's challenges. Julia stood beside Sophie, while Emily served as maid of honor, her wheelchair adorned with flowers that matched her bouquet. "From the moment I met you in that study group," Michael said in his vows, "I knew you saw me. Not my wheelchair, not my limitations, but me. Just like your parents taught you, you look for the person behind the challenge, the strength within the struggle." Sophie's voice shook as she responded, "You helped me understand that healing isn't just about fixing what's broken, it's about discovering new ways to be whole. Together, we'll continue to help others find their wings, their strength, their way back to flight." As they exchanged rings, each one incorporating a small butterfly design, Emily's dancers began their performance. Above them, real and projected butterflies created a canopy of movement and light, while Michael's neural response systems translated the audience's collective joy into patterns of colored light that danced through the air. Later, at the reception, Richard raised his glass for a toast. To Sophie and Michael, who remind us that love, like healing, comes in many forms. To Emily, whose art shows us that dance knows no boundaries. And to all of you who make the Thornfield Foundation not just a place of healing, but a home for transforming dreams. Alexander held Julia close as they watched their daughter dance with her new husband, their wheelchairs moving in perfect synchronization to the music. "Our butterfly has found her perfect flight pattern," he whispered. "They all have," Julia agreed, watching Emily lead her dance students in a celebration of movement that defied traditional limitations. As the evening stars appeared, the garden glowed with possibility. Michael's lights creating patterns that matched the dancers' movements, real butterflies mixing with projected ones in a dance of nature and technology, of past and future, of love that continues to find new ways to transform and soar. The Thornfield legacy was evolving, growing, transforming, just like the butterflies that had started it all. In Sophie and Michael's union, science merged with compassion, technology with healing, creating new possibilities for those yet to find their wings.